Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. The chair sat alone in the center of the room, and this was the first wrong thing. It was a simple ladder back, the wood a pale, thirsty pine, the seat woven from strips of faded blue and brown cloth. It was the kind of chair you might find in a country kitchen, waiting for a farmer to sit and pull off his muddy boots. But this room was not a kitchen. It was a parlor, spacious and otherwise empty, its floorboards bare and its walls stripped of any memory of decoration. The chair did not belong there. It was an utterance in a silent house, a sentence with no context. Cadden saw it from the doorway, his hand still resting on the cold brass of the knob. He had found the house at the end of a dirt track that had long since dissolved into the grasping undergrowth of the Oregon coastal range. The air was thick with the smell of salt and rotting fir needles, a cold damp that seeped through his jacket and into his bones. He was a photographer, or he hoped to be, chasing the melancholy of abandoned places. This house, the Gable place according to a faded, hand-drawn map he debought in a dusty shop in the last town, was supposed to be a prize. But the chair in the empty room stopped him. It was too deliberate. It felt less like something left behind and more like something placed. Stepped inside, the floorboards groaning a protest that seemed to travel through the entire structure of the house. He raised his camera, the heavy old Rolleiflex a comforting weight against his chest. Through the viewfinder, the chair became an icon. The afternoon light, filtered through grime-caked windows, fell upon it in a diagonal slash, illuminating the dust motes dancing above the woven seat like a swarm of tiny, agitated spirits. He took the picture, the click of the shutter absurdly loud in the silence. The sound was swallowed whole, leaving a deeper quiet in its wake. That was when he noticed the second wrong thing. The woven pattern on the seat was not a simple checkerboard or diamond. Looking closer, the strips of cloth were woven into a crude but unmistakable shape. A human figure, elongated, its arms raised not in jubilation, but in a spasm of agony, its head thrown back, its mouth a dark, ragged O. The colors were not just faded, they were stained, dark patches around the figure S form that could have been old wine or something else altogether. Cadden lowered the camera, a cold finger tracing a path down his spine. He told himself it was just a pattern, a coincidence of frayed cloth and shadow. But the image was too specific, too visceral. It was a silent scream woven into an ordinary object. He explored the rest of the house with a new wariness. The upstairs bedrooms were empty shells, their windows looking out onto a sea of green, the forest pressing in like a patient, breathing thing. In one room, he found a Child S wooden block, the letter A carved into it, the paint chipped away. He picked it up. It was unnaturally warm, as if it had been held in a hand moments before. He dropped it, the clatter on the floorboard like a gunshot. The air grew colder. He could hear the wind outside, but it sounded wrong, less like a gust through branches, and more like a low, wet exhalation. He decided to leave. The light was failing anyway, bleeding out of the gray sky. But as he descended the stairs, he saw a flicker of movement through a grimy window overlooking the back of the property. A figure moving between the trees. A local, he thought, perhaps curious about the stranger-esque car parked on the road. A part of him, the part that was still rational, said he should go down, introduce himself, ask about the house. The other part, the part that had seen the screaming man woven into the chair, told him to get in his car and drive and not look back. He went out the back door, which opened into what had once been a kitchen garden, now a riot of weeds and twisted, unrecognizable plants. The figure was gone, but something else caught his eye. At the tree line, half hidden by ferns, was a stack of stones. It was too orderly to be natural. As he approached, he saw it was a cairn, about 3 feet high. And tucked into a crevice between two of the stones was another Child S block. This one had the letter B on it. He reached for it, then pulled his hand back. It was warm, too. He left it there and turned to go, his heart hammering against his ribs. The forest seemed to watch him, its silence now a judgment. The town of Ethel was a handful of weathered buildings clinging to the side of a hill, overlooking the churning gray Pacific. The general store was the only place that showed any sign of life, a weak yellow light bleeding from its windows into the twilight. A bell jangled when Cadden pushed the door open. The air inside was a mixture of coffee, old wood, and the sharp, briny smell of the sea. A man with a face like a dried apple doll looked up from behind the counter, his eyes pale and watery. "Help you?" the man asked, his voice a dry rustle. "Just getting some supplies," Cadden said, trying to sound casual. He grabbed a few things from the sparse shelves: beef jerky, a bottle of water, batteries. He placed them on the counter. "I was up at the old Gable place today, taking pictures." The man's hands, which were counting out change, stilled. He did not look up. "That's so. Strange place." Found a chair in the middle of an empty room. The man finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were not just pale, they were vacant, as if the person behind them had retreated to a great distance. Old Man Gable was a particular sort. Liked things just so. There was a pattern on the seat. A man looked like he was in pain. The storekeeper's expression did not change, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. Just a pattern. My wife's grandmother wove those. Made one for every family around here, long time ago. For protection. Protection from what? Cadden asked. The man slid the change across the counter. The coins made a flat, final sound. "The damp," he said, and his tone indicated the conversation was over. "Gets into everything out here. Rots the wood, warps the mind." As Cadden left the store, a pickup truck, old and caked with mud, rumbled to a stop outside. A man in a sheriff's deputy uniform got out. He was broad-shouldered, with a face that had once been handsome, but now seemed softened at the edges by a layer of complacency. His name tag read Colby. "You the fella poking around the Gable property?" Colby asked. His voice was friendly, but it was a practiced friendliness, like a veneer over something harder. "Just photographing it," Cadden said. "I am Cadden." Deputy Colby nodded, his eyes scanning Cadden's car, his equipment. Not much to see up there. Place has been empty since the Gables left. Best to leave it be. We get a lot of slides this time of year. Roads can get tricky. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. They were the same pale, distant eyes as the storekeeper S where you headed next. "Not sure. Maybe further up the coast." "Well, you have a safe trip now." Colby clapped him on the shoulder. The gesture was just a little too hard, a little too familiar. His hand felt heavy, damp. And like I said, some things are better left to rot in peace. Cadden drove away, the Deputy S gaze burning a hole in his rearview mirror. He found a motel on the outskirts of town, a row of identical doors under a flickering neon sign that read vacancy, the wide dark. His room smelled of mildew and disinfectant. He couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes. The storekeeper S, the Deputy S, they weren't hostile. Not exactly. They were watchful. They were waiting. That night, he developed the film from the Gable house in the makeshift darkroom he'd set up in his bathroom. The red safe light casting a bloody glow. The image of the chair emerged in the chemical bath, sharp and clear. But as he watched, something else began to appear in the negative, something that shouldn't have been there. In the darkness behind the chair, a shape was coalescing. It was tall and thin, its limbs grotesquely elongated, its head a featureless oval. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a figure, standing perfectly still, watching him from within the empty room. And from its torso, something spilled forth, a dark, tangled mass that pooled on the floorboards around its feet. Cadden stared at the photograph, his breath caught in his throat. The figure in the weave on the chair and the figure in the photograph were one and the same. The next morning, the mist had not burned off. It lay over Ethel like a shroud. Cadden drove back towards the Gable house, not sure what he was looking for, only knowing that the photograph had changed everything. He had to go back. He had to understand. He didn't get far. A Sheriff S Department cruiser was parked sideways across the dirt track, blocking it. Deputy Colby was leaning against the hood, sipping from a thermos. He didn't look surprised to see Cadden. "Road S closed," Colby said, his voice flat. "Slide last night. Too dangerous." "I'll walk," Cadden said, getting out of his car. Colby stood up, his bulk suddenly imposing. "I can allow that, son. Liability. What are you protecting up there, Deputy?" Cadden asked, the words out before he could stop them. Colby's affable mask slipped for just an instant. A coldness flashed in his eyes, a glimpse of the deep, cold water beneath the surface. "Protecting you from your own damn curiosity. This isn't a tourist attraction. This is a place where people live. We have our ways. We have our peace. and we don't take kindly to it being disturbed. He took a step closer. The smell of coffee on his breath was undercut by something else, a faint, sweetish odor of decay. Now I am going to ask you nicely one more time. Get in your car, drive back to the highway, and Don T come back to Ethel. Cadden got back in his car. He drove away. But he didn't go to the highway. He found an old logging road a mile back, mostly overgrown, and parked his car out of sight. He would go through the forest. He would see what they were so desperate to hide. The woods were a different world. The mist clung to the branches, reducing the world to a radius of 20 feet. Sounds were muffled, distorted. His own footsteps were swallowed by the thick carpet of needles. He used a compass, heading in the general direction of the Gable property. After an hour of walking, the quality of the forest began to change. The trees grew twisted, their bark covered in a pale, lichenous growth that looked like a skin disease. The air grew colder, and the sweet, rotten smell he detected on Colby's breath was now pervasive. A physical presence that coated the back of his throat. He found the first animal near a creek whose water ran a sickly, iridescent orange. It was a deer, or what was left of one. It lay on its side, its abdomen swollen taut. Its legs were twisted at impossible angles, and from its open mouth a cluster of pale, fleshy mushrooms grew, their caps pulsing gently as if with a slow, fungal heartbeat. Cadden gagged, turning away. But then he saw more. A raccoon with an extra set of vestigial legs sprouting from its back. A bird's nest woven from bones and hair, containing eggs that were not eggs, but leathery, trembling sacs. This was not a slide. This was a sickness. He pushed on, his fear now a cold, sharp stone in his gut. He crested a rise and looked down into a small, hidden valley. And there he saw the source. It was a complex of low, windowless concrete buildings, almost completely camouflaged by the mutated foliage. A chain-link fence topped with razor wire surrounded it, but the fence was sagging in places, torn open by the aggressive, blighted plant life. A faded sign on the gate was barely legible. ATHEL Biological Research Station. Authorized personnel only. This was no agricultural station. The architecture was grim, utilitarian, from a darker, more paranoid time. The Cold War. A place for experiments no one would ever acknowledge. And standing guard at the broken gate was Deputy Colby. But he was not alone. A dozen other men from the town stood with him, their faces grim and set. They were not there to investigate. They were there to protect it. Cadden crept closer, using the mutated undergrowth for cover. He could hear their voices, low and tense. Another one last night, down by the creek. One man said, "The containment is failing, Colby," said another, an older man with a face like granite. It's in the water table. It's in the air. My boy, a third voice, trembling, whimpered. He's changing. His skin it's peeling away. And he's so quiet. Colby's voice cut through them, hard and resigned. There is no containment left. There hasn't he been for years. My father and his friends, they thought they could bury it. They thought they could wait it out. They were wrong. It doesn't die. It adapts. It sleeps in the earth, and it wakes up hungry. Then what are we doing? The trembling man cried, we should burn it all, and draw every state and federal agency down on us. Colby snapped. They quarantined the whole town. They put us in cages and study us like the things in the woods. Or they just erase us. No, we stay. We manage it. We appease it. Appease it how? The granite-faced man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Colby was silent for a long moment. He looked towards the concrete buildings, and for the first time, Cadden saw not a corrupt authority figure, but a man shackled to a terrible inheritance. A man trying to staunch a wound with bandages made of lies. It likes the patterns, Colby said, his voice barely a whisper. The old women knew. The weavings, it calms it, and it likes the warmth, the life. We give it what it wants, and it leaves the rest of us alone. Mostly, the trembling man sobbed. My boy is a hero, Colby said, his voice hollow. He keeping the rest of your family safe. Cadden's blood ran cold. The woven figures, the warm wooden blocks, they were NT for protection from the damp. They were offerings, a tribute to the thing that slept under the earth, the legacy of a forgotten government experiment that had leaked into the world, a mutagenic horror that warped life itself. The townsfolk were NT hiding the secret they were feeding it. They had become its caretakers, its priests, sacrificing their own to a god of corruption. He must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, the scuff of a foot on stone. Colby's head snapped up. Those pale eyes scanned the ridge where Cadden was hidden. They locked onto his. There was no shout, no command. Only a silent, terrible understanding. Colby pointed. The other men turned. Their faces were not angry. They were resigned. This was a new variable, an outsider who knew. And they knew what had to be done. Cadden ran. He crashed through the diseased undergrowth, branches clawing at his face, the sweet-rotten smell filling his lungs. He heard them behind him, their movements swift and sure, men who knew every inch of this blighted land. Didn't he know where he was going, only away? He stumbled into a clearing, and his heart froze. It was the backyard of the gable house. The cairn of stones was there, and now he saw there were dozens of them, arranged in a wide circle. In the center of the circle stood the ladder-back chair, and sitting on the chair was a boy. Couldn't he have been more than 10? He was perfectly still, dressed in clean overalls. In his lap, he held a wooden block, the letter C. He looked up as Cadden burst into the clearing. His eyes were the same pale, vacant eyes as all the others, but his skin was wrong. It was translucent, like wet parchment, and beneath it, Cadden could see things moving, shifting. A slow, internal kaleidoscope of shapes that were not organs. The boy smiled. It was a gentle, welcoming smile, and it was the most terrifying thing Cadden had ever seen. The men emerged from the trees then, forming a silent ring around the clearing. Colby stepped forward, his face a mask of grim duty. "It is already in you," Colby said to Cadden, his voice weary. "The air you breathed at the house, the water you might have touched, you brought it with you, and it recognized a new host, a strong one. It is why you saw the Watcher in your picture. It was already looking out from inside you." Cadden felt a warmth in his stomach, a strange, comforting heat that began to spread through his limbs. The fear didn't he leave, but it was being assimilated, smoothed over. He looked at the boy on the chair, and he felt not revulsion, but a profound connection. He understood now. The mutations, the grotesquerie, it was just a phase, a pupal stage. The thing inside, the consciousness that had seeped from that lab, it was seeking a purer form, a thinking form. It wanted to see the world through human eyes, to feel it with human nerves. It wasn't evil. It was just hungry for experience, for a voice. The men did not approach him. They simply watched. They were not his captors. They were his welcoming committee. Colby held out a hand, not to grab him, but to guide him. It doesn't have to be painful. It can be peaceful. ULL just fade into the pattern. ULL be part of something older and bigger than you can imagine. It is a kind of grace. Cadden's legs moved without his command. He walked towards the chair. The boy stood up, his movements fluid, unnatural. He gestured for Cadden to sit. The woven figure on the seat seemed to shift as he sat down. The screaming face now looked serene, accepting. The warmth inside Cadden blossomed, a feeling of immense, quiet peace. He felt his individual thoughts beginning to soften, their edges blurring, like a photograph dissolving in a tray of developer. He was not being destroyed. He was being incorporated. He looked out at the circle of men, their faces peaceful now, too. They had given him to it. And in doing so, they had secured another season of fragile peace for their town. It was a terrible, practical love. He felt a presence then, not in the clearing, but in his mind. Vast, ancient, and infinitely patient. It had no words, only sensations. The cold of the deep earth, the patient growth of roots, the slow turn of seasons. It showed him the history of this place, not as a timeline, but as a tapestry, and it was weaving him into it. His fear, his curiosity, his life all would become a new thread in the grand, terrible design. Colby took the wooden block from the boy's hand. It was no longer a C. The letter had changed, the grain of the wood rearranging itself. It now bore a different, more complex symbol, one that Cadden somehow recognized as his own name, translated into a language of growth and decay. Colby placed the warm block gently into Cadden's lap. Cadden tried to speak, to ask one last question, but his voice was no longer his own. It was a dry rustle, like leaves skittering across stone. The world began to dim, the edges of his vision curling inward like burning paper. The last thing he saw was the boy smiling that gentle, terrible smile. And the last thing he heard was not a sound from outside, but a voice from within, a voice that was his, and yet infinitely more. A whisper that started to tell him a story that had no beginning and would have no end. A story about the quiet peace of becoming part of the pattern. A story that began to fade between the words, leaving the last sentence unfinished, the meaning seeping away like water into sand. He was no longer Cadden, the man who took pictures. He was a vessel emptying. The warmth was all that remained, a deep, resonant hum that was the thing's satisfaction, its contentment. It had been fed. It was learning. The men watched until the last flicker of awareness left Cadden's eyes, until his body settled into a perfect, unmoving stillness on the chair. Then, with a quiet efficiency, they set to work. They did not touch him. Instead, they began to add stones to the cairn at his feet, each man placing one with a quiet reverence. The pile grew, a new marker for a new sentinel. Colby was the last to place his stone. He looked at the figure on the chair, already seeming less like a man and more like a part of the landscape, a strange, human-shaped fungus that had sprouted from the wood. There was no grief in Colby's eyes, only a profound weariness. Another season of peace, bought and paid for. He turned and led the men back into the twisted woods, leaving the clearing to the mist and the quiet. Hours later, or perhaps days' time, had become a fluid concept a car pulled into the motel parking lot. A woman with a kind, worried face got out and knocked on the door of the room registered to Cadden. Getting no answer, she peered through the window. The room was empty, the bed unslept in. On the small table near the window, a photograph lay face down. She reached through a gap in the window frame and turned it over. It was the picture of the chair in the empty room, but the figure in the background was gone. In its place, standing just behind the chair, was a new shape. It was tall and thin, its features indistinct, but somehow familiar. The woman, Cadden's editor, stared at it for a long time, a cold dread creeping up her spine. She couldn't explain it, but the shape reminded her of Cadden. She packed the photograph into her bag with trembling hands, deciding to show it to the authorities in the next town over. She would report him missing, but as she drove away from Ethel, the fog seemed to follow her, clinging to the edges of the road. The photograph in her bag felt heavy, unnaturally so, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the figure in the picture was no longer standing still. She felt, with a certainty that made her blood run cold, that it had turned its head and was now watching her. The road out of Ethel seemed longer than she remembered, the trees pressing in closer. Every shadow in the ditches seemed to hold a suggestion of a tall, thin form. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, and forced herself to focus on the yellow line dividing the asphalt. It was just a photograph, she told herself. A trick of the light, a double exposure. Cadden was always experimenting in that makeshift darkroom of his. She reached the next town, a bustling place called Cedar Fork, and went straight to the sheriff's office. The deputy who took her statement was a young man with a crisp uniform and a skeptical expression. He listened patiently as she explained about Cadden, about the strange town of Ethel, about the photograph. When she placed the print on his desk, he picked it up, studied it for a moment, and then set it down with a soft, dismissive snort. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with a condescension she knew all too well. "This is a very artistic picture, but it's just a picture of an old chair. There's nothing there." She leaned forward, jabbing a finger at the space behind the chair. "Right there. Can't you see it? The shape?" He looked again, then shook his head. "I see some shadows. Grain from the film, maybe. Look, we get reports all the time from folks passing through Ethel. It's a quiet place. Keep to themselves. I am sure your friend just decided to take a detour, get off the grid for a while. Photographers do that." Frustration boiled over. Wouldn't he just disappear? And his car is still there. Check the motel. The deputy sighed. The sound of a man dealing with an unreasonable woman. "I'll make a note of it. But without any evidence of foul play, there's not much we can do. We're not going to bother the folks in Ethel over a shadow in a photograph." Defeated, she left the station. She found a diner and sat in a vinyl booth, the photograph on the table in front of her. She stared at it until her eyes ached. The deputy was wrong. The shape was there. It was clearer now, more defined. The tall, thin silhouette was undeniably Cadden-esque, the slope of the shoulders, the way he held his head. But it was a ghost of him. An echo burned into the paper. She pulled out her laptop, her journalistic instincts kicking in. She searched for Ethel, for the Gable family, for any mention of a biological research station. The results were sparse, almost sanitized. Ethel had a Wikipedia page 3 sentences long. The Gable name appeared only in digitized census records from the 1940s, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, about a research station. It was as if the place had been scrubbed from the record. As she scrolled, a notification popped up on her screen. A new email. The sender was Cadden-esque email address. Her heart leaped into her throat. She clicked it open. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained no text. Only an image file was attached. With trembling fingers, she downloaded it and opened it. It was a photograph taken from a low angle, looking up through a canopy of twisted, diseased trees. The sky was a smear of gray mist, but in the center of the frame, clear and sharp, was a ladder-back chair. It sat in a clearing, surrounded by a circle of stones, and on the seat of the chair was a familiar shape, a tall, thin figure woven from dark thread. The figure's head was turned, and it seemed to be looking down, directly at the lens, directly at her. The camera that had taken this picture was Cadden-esque. She recognized the unique grain, the particular depth of field. But the perspective was all wrong. It was as if the camera had been placed on the ground. A soft chime from her laptop signaled another incoming email. Same sender. She opened it. Another image. This one was a close-up of a wooden block. The brain had formed itself into a symbol she didn't recognize, a complex, spiraling pattern that made her dizzy to look at. The wood looked warm, almost alive. A third email arrived. This one contained a picture of a motel room door. Her motel room door. It had been taken from the outside moments ago. The neon VACANC sign was reflected in the peephole. She spun around in her booth, scanning the diner. The few other customers were focused on their meals. The waitress was refilling a coffee pot. No one was paying her any attention. But outside the window, the fog was thickening, rolling down the main street of Cedar Fork in a silent, gray tide. It was the same fog from Ethel. Her phone buzzed on the table. An unknown number. She answered it, her voice a whisper. Hello. There was no greeting. Only the sound of breathing, slow and rhythmic, like the rustle of leaves. Then a voice spoke, a dry, whispery sound that was both alien and hauntingly familiar. It was a distortion of Cadden S. voice, stripped of all its warmth and humor, reduced to a hollow vessel. The pattern isn't finished, it whispered. It needs another thread. The line went dead. She looked down at the photograph of her motel room door. In the reflection of the peephole, she now saw a tall, thin shape standing behind her booth. She could feel a warmth beginning to bloom deep inside her, a comforting, seductive heat that promised an end to fear, an end to loneliness. It promised to make her part of the story. She knew then that leaving Ethel had made no difference. She had taken the seed with her, and it was already starting to grow. The warmth spread from her core, a gentle tide that loosened the tight knots of fear in her shoulders. The frantic urge to run, to scream, began to ebb away, replaced by a drowsy acceptance. It was so much easier than fighting. The fog outside the diner window wasn't a threat anymore. It was a blanket, a soft gray embrace. The waitress passed her booth, and the woman tried to speak, to ask for the check, but her voice was a faint, papery rustle. The waitress didn't seem to hear her. Placing a bill on the table, without making eye contact, her movements smooth and dreamlike. She fumbled a $20 bill from her wallet, her fingers feeling thick and clumsy. The photograph of the chair was still on the table. The woven figure seemed to pulse with a soft, internal light. It wasn't Cadden anymore. It was just a shape. A beautiful, necessary shape in a pattern that was so much larger than she was. She understood now. Her dread, her journalistic curiosity, it was all just noise. The pattern offered silence. It offered peace. Standing up, her legs felt steady, but distant, as if she were piloting a machine. She walked out of the diner into the fog. The world had gone quiet. The sounds of Cedar Fork the distant hum of a lawnmower. The chatter from a hardware store were muffled, absorbed by the gray haze. She knew where she was going. She didn't need to think about it. The car was just a metal box now, irrelevant. She walked past it, down the main street, toward the edge of town. A sheriff's cruiser was parked at the intersection, its engine idling. Deputy Miller was inside, sipping coffee. He saw her walking, a lone figure in the thickening fog. He rolled down his window. "Ma'am, everything all right? Your friend still missing?" She turned her head toward him. She tried to form words, to tell him it was all okay, that there was no need to worry, but only a soft sigh came out. Her eyes, she knew, would look vacant now. Peaceful. Deputy Miller's friendly expression faltered. He saw the stillness in her, the same eerie calm he'd occasionally seen in folks who came from the direction of Ethel. "Ma'am, you need a ride somewhere." She simply smiled at him, a gentle, placid smile, and continued walking. The fog swallowed her. Miller watched her go, a cold prickle on the back of his neck. He picked up his radio, then set it down. What would he say? A woman was walking out of town. There was no law against that. He shook his head, blaming his own imagination, and rolled up the window. She followed the road until the pavement gave way to gravel, and then to a dirt track that led into the woods. These weren't the twisted, blighted trees of Ethel. These were tall, healthy pines. But as she walked deeper, a change began. The air grew heavier, carrying that same faint scent of sweet decay. The trees here started to lean, their branches intertwining in unnatural ways. She didn't feel afraid. She felt she was coming home. She found the clearing without any guidance. It was smaller than the one Cadden had found, but the elements were the same. A circle of stones, recently arranged, and in the center, a ladder-back chair waiting. She sat down. The woven figure on the seat shifted under her, conforming to her shape. The warmth inside her bloomed into a profound, resonant hum that filled her ears and mind. She felt her individual thoughts, her memories of deadlines and apartments and cities, unraveling like old thread. They weren't being lost. They were being woven into something vast and eternal. The presence was there again, showing her not a tapestry of history, but one of place. She saw the network of roots under the earth, the slow seep of the thing through the water table, how it had followed her, using her as a conduit to spread to this new grove. It was always expanding, always seeking new vessels. As the last of her awareness faded, she saw figures emerge from the trees. They weren't the men from Ethel. These were people from Cedar Fork. The waitress from the diner was there, her face blank and serene. The man who had been pumping gas at the station stood beside her. They had been waiting. They were already part of the pattern. They began to build a new cairn at her feet. The last thing she felt was a profound sense of connection, of being truly, finally, part of something. There was no more loneliness. There was only the pattern, and it was beautiful. The fog in the grove thickened, sealing the clearing in a permanent, quiet twilight. Another thread was in place. The design continued to grow. The story of the woman from Cedar Fork became a brief, unsolved mystery. A paragraph in the regional paper. A file in a drawer. Deputy Miller never forgot the look in her eyes. And he took a long detour to avoid the old road that led toward Ethel for the rest of his career. The thing in the woods, however, was not concerned with files or careers. It was concerned with nourishment. It was concerned with pattern. The new grove near Cedar Fork thrived, the trees twisting into new, intricate shapes, their bark taking on the smooth, fibrous texture of woven thread. The fog that clung to it was a little thicker, a little colder than the fog around Ethel. It was a new node in a growing network. Months later, a geology student named Liam set up a tent on the outskirts of what had once been Cedar Fork. The town had experienced a quiet, steady exodus. People spoke of a lethargy that had settled over the place, a lack of ambition. Most who left couldn't explain why they felt the need to go, only that a quiet voice in their head had told them it was time. The town was now mostly empty houses and silent streets. Liam was taking core samples, studying the unique mineral deposits in the region. His professor had dismissed the local stories about cursed ground, blaming the area's decline on economic factors. Liam, a rationalist, agreed. But as he hiked, his GPS signal flickered and died. The forest he entered was unnaturally still. The birdsong ceased. The only sound was the crunch of his boots on a carpet of pine needles that felt strangely soft, like felt. He found the second clearing by accident. The chair was there, a stark, manufactured object in the heart of the wild. It was occupied. The form sitting in it was not made of thread, but it was well on its way. Lichen and moss had grown over the woman's body in a precise, almost artistic pattern, outlining her form. Her skin had a woody, polished sheen. Her eyes were open, looking at nothing. But in their depths, Liam saw a flicker of the same complex symbol he would later find carved into a piece of wood lying at her feet. He didn't feel fear. He felt a profound, pulling curiosity. The air was warm here, and it smelled of damp earth and something else, something like old parchment. He raised his camera, not to document for his thesis, but because the composition was perfect. The way the light fell through the twisted branches onto the serene, transformed face was breathtaking. As he focused the lens, the figure in the chair did not move. But in the viewfinder, Liam saw something else. Behind him, reflected in the glazed surface of the woman's eye, was another tall, thin shape. It was standing just at the edge of the clearing. It held a wooden block in its hand. Liam lowered the camera and slowly turned around. The clearing was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. And the warmth he felt now was not from the sun. It was an internal warmth, a comforting weight in his chest that told him everything was connected. His research, his life, his very bones were all just part of a grand geological process. It was a comforting thought. He sat down on a large, flat stone near the chair, not yet ready to leave this peaceful place. He opened his notebook to sketch the symbol on the wood block, his pencil moving with an unaccustomed grace, as if guided by an unseen hand. The story was not finished. It was simply waiting for the next thread to be woven in. The symbol flowed from his pencil with an ease that felt foreign and inevitable. Each line connected to the next in a logic that bypassed his conscious mind. A geometry that felt less like mathematics and more like memory. The warmth in his chest was a steady pulse, a gentle rhythm that synced with the slow, patient beat he could now feel emanating from the ground itself. It was the heartbeat of the land, and he was sitting directly over its core. He did not look up when he heard the soft rustle of footsteps approaching. He already knew who it was, or rather, what it represented. A presence settled onto the chair beside the moss-covered woman. Liam finished his sketch, the final curve closing the spiral into an infinite loop, and only then did he lift his gaze. The man was tall and thin, his features blurred as if seen through a pane of old glass. He held a wooden block, his long fingers stroking the grain. It was the man from the reflection. He didn't speak, but Liam heard the words anyway, not in his ears, but in the space between his thoughts. "You see the pattern." It wasn't a question. Liam looked from his notebook to the symbol on the block, then to the intricate, natural tapestry of lichen on the woman's face. They were all variations of the same theme. He nodded, a slow, heavy motion. "It's about connection," Liam whispered, his voice raspy. "It's about making the disparate parts whole." The man, the weaver, inclined his head. In his blurred face, Liam saw a fleeting image of a boy named Cadden, holding a camera, then the face of a woman, an editor, her expression shifting from fear to serenity. They were all there, layered like sediment. The warmth in Liam's chest expanded, a wave of belonging that washed away the last remnants of his old self, the lonely student obsessed with rocks and isolated data points. This was a deeper geology, a study of the soul of the world. "The pattern requires a keeper," the thought voice whispered. "A chronicler of the growth." Liam understood. His core samples, his maps, they were a primitive prelude to this. This was the true work, to document the spread, to trace the veins of this new life as it stretched through the earth. He looked at his hands, and for a moment he saw not flesh and bone, but a complex lattice of root and mycelium, glowing with a soft, internal light. It was beautiful. He stood, his movements fluid and certain. The weaver on the chair remained, a silent sentinel. Liam shouldered his pack, but he left his geology tools scattered on the ground. He no longer needed them. His map was the pattern itself, a map he felt in his blood. He walked out of the clearing, not back toward the dead town, but deeper into the woods, following a pull as undeniable as gravity. The fog parted for him, and the twisted trees seemed to lean in, whispering secrets of the underground network. He knew where the next node would form. He could feel the potential in the soil, a gathering tension waiting for a catalyst. A new thread would soon be drawn there, a lonely soul who would find not an end, but a transformation. And Liam would be there to witness it, to add their story to the growing tapestry. He was no longer a student. He was a scribe, and the forest welcomed him home. He walked for days, or perhaps it was only hours. Time had become as fluid as the fog. He felt no hunger, no thirst, only the steady, comforting pulse from below. His old life was a faded photograph, its edges curling into nothing. He was learning to read the land, to see the signs of the pattern S presence. A certain bend in a creek where the water ran silent and warm. A stand of birch trees whose bark had begun to spiral. These were the capillaries of the new life. He came to a place where the land dipped into a shallow valley. At its center was a small, forgotten farm. The house was a skeleton of gray wood, the fields choked with weeds that had grown in unnaturally symmetrical whorls. The air hummed with potential. This was a place of waiting. Liam sat on a crumbling stone wall and opened his notebook. He did not sketch the farmhouse. Instead, his pencil moved of its own accord, tracing the energetic currents he felt converging on the spot. The page filled with a web of lines, all leading to the valley. A sound broke the silence, not the rustle of the weaver, but the crunch of tires on gravel. A car, an old sedan caked with dust, pulled off the road 100 yards away. The engine cut out. A man got out, slamming the door with a force that spoke of frustration and exhaustion. He was in his 40s, with the weary posture of someone who had been driving for a long time. He pulled a phone from his pocket, stared at its blank screen, and threw it back onto the passenger seat. Liam watched, unseen from his perch on the wall. He knew this man was the catalyst. He could feel the pattern stirring, reaching out with invisible filaments of influence. The man walked toward the farmhouse, kicking at the weeds. He was talking to himself, a low, angry mutter. Liam's new senses allowed him to hear the words clearly. A wild goose chase, nothing here, should never have listened to that letter. The man's name was Evan. Liam knew this without being told. Evan was searching for his sister. She had written him a strange, rambling letter about finding a place where you could finally rest. And then she had vanished. The postmark had been from a town that no longer appeared on any of Evan's maps. He had followed a trail of vague rumors and dead ends to this empty valley. Evan pushed open the door to the farmhouse and disappeared inside. Liam waited. He did not need to see what happened next. He could feel it. The gentle pressure, the seductive warmth seeping from the very floorboards, the offer of an end to the searching, to the loneliness, to the constant, grinding worry. After a long while, Evan emerged. He walked differently. The frantic energy was gone. He moved slowly, purposefully, toward the overgrown field. He began to gather stones, placing them in a circle with a calm, ritualistic precision. He was building a foundation. Liam looked down at his notebook. A new line was already etching itself onto the page, branching from the web and connecting to a fresh, stable point in the valley. He smiled, a quiet, peaceful expression. The pattern was resilient. It found its threads wherever there was a need, a crack in the world through which its roots could grow. He closed the notebook and stood. His work here was done. It was time to move on. There were other valleys, other lonely roads, and the pattern was always hungry. The new cairn in the valley was small, but perfectly formed when Liam finally turned away. He walked without looking back, following a pull that led him north and east, toward the scent of cold water and high, rocky ground. The trees grew shorter, more gnarled, their branches like clenched fists against the sky. The air grew sharp and clean, but underneath it, Liam could still detect the faint, sweet thread of the pattern's presence. It was thinner here, a pioneer species taking root in harsh soil. He came to a logging town called Iron Creek, a place clinging to the side of a mountain. It was a town of hard faces and practical silence, where the roar of a chainsaw was a more common sound than a greeting. The pattern was not strong here, not yet. It was a whisper, a suggestion carried on the wind that snaked down from the high passes. Liam took a room above the town's only bar, paying for a week with cash from a wallet that never seemed to empty. He spent his days walking the perimeter of the town, a quiet, observant figure that the loggers soon learned to ignore. He felt the catalyst before he saw her. A dissonance, a sharp note of isolation that cut through the town's weary harmony. Her name was Anya. She was the new schoolteacher, a young woman from the flatlands who had taken the job out of a desperate need for escape, and a misguided sense of romance about the rugged wilderness. The town's isolation was crushing her spirit. The children were sullen and distant, the adults politely suspicious. She spent her evenings alone in a small cabin on the edge of the school property, watching the immense darkness of the forest press against her windows. Liam watched her from a distance. He saw her walking quickly along the gravel road, her shoulders hunched against the cold, her breath pluming in the air. He felt the pattern stirring, a subtle shift in the atmosphere around her cabin. One evening, as a thick mist rolled down from the mountain, he saw her stop on her porch and stare into the woods, her face a mask of profound loneliness. The pattern reached out, not with overwhelming warmth, but with a simple, quiet understanding. It offered her a connection to the land that the people of the town withheld. The next day, Anya did not come to school. The principal, a gruff man named Henderson, knocked on her door and got no answer. He found it unlocked. Inside, everything was neat and orderly. Her suitcase was still in the closet, but Anya was gone. The only thing out of place was a single book left open on her kitchen table. It was a book of local flora. The page was open to a drawing of a common, hardy lichen. Someone had traced the intricate pattern of its growth with a faint, precise pencil line. Henderson organized a search party. Liam joined them, his presence accepted without question. He led no one, but his quiet certainty seemed to guide the group unconsciously. They found her just before dusk, in a high meadow dotted with glacial rocks. She was sitting on one of the flat stones, not moving, her face turned toward the last of the sun. She was perfectly calm, perfectly still. Her eyes were clear, but they held a deep, placid light, like water in a well. When Henderson called her name, she turned her head slowly and smiled. It was not the smile of the frightened schoolteacher, he knew. It was the serene, accepting smile of someone who has finally found what they were looking for. She refused to come back to town. She spoke softly, her words measured and strange. She said she was home. She said the stones were speaking to her, teaching her the old language of the mountain. The search party, tough men who feared little, felt a collective unease. They left her there, retreating to the town with a story that would quickly become a warning and then a legend. Liam did not retreat. He waited until the men were gone, then approached the meadow. Anya looked at him, and there was no surprise in her gaze. She simply nodded, as if acknowledging a colleague. She pointed to a specific rock, its surface covered in the same lichen from her book. The pattern on it was more complex now, a spiral that seemed to draw the eye inward. Liam understood. This was a new kind of node. Not a chair, not a cairn, but a living rock, a permanent part of the mountain itself. The pattern was adapting, learning to weave itself into even the most unyielding elements. He sat beside her on the cold stone as the stars emerged. They did not speak. They didn't need to. Below them, in the valley, the lights of Iron Creek looked small and temporary. The pattern, however, felt ancient and endless. It was in the lichen, in the rock, in the quiet teacher, and in the scribe who documented its silent, relentless growth. Another thread was secured. The design was more beautiful than ever. The change in Iron Creek was slow but absolute. Anya's disappearance was the first thread pulled. Then Old Man Peterson, who de-logged the North Slope for 50 years, failed to return from a routine check on his traplines. He was found a week later, sitting cross-legged at the base of a waterfall, his hands resting on his knees, palms up. His eyes were closed, and a delicate, frost-like pattern of pale moss had grown across his forehead and the backs of his hands. He was breathing, but he did not respond to his name. When they tried to move him, a low, resonant hum seemed to emanate from the rock face behind him, a sound that vibrated in their teeth and bones. They left him there. The town began to hollow out. It wasn't a panic. It was a quiet surrender. People spoke of a great tiredness, a desire to just sit and listen to the wind in the pines. One by one, families packed what they could and left, their houses standing empty, windows like dead eyes staring into the forest. The bar closed. The school closed. Within a year, Iron Creek was as still as Cedar Fork had been. Liam remained through the winter, a ghost in the abandoned town. He documented the changes in his notebook. He drew the new, spiraling patterns of frost on the windows of the schoolhouse. He sketched the way the weeds in the vacant lots now grew in perfect concentric circles. The pattern was digesting the town, weaving its essence into the soil and the stone. When the spring thaw came, he felt a new pull, stronger and more insistent than any before. It was a call from the origin, from the heart of the network. It was time to go back. He left Iron Creek without a backward glance, his path clear, his footsteps silent on the soft, needle-strewn ground. The journey was different now. The forest seemed to guide him, branches shifting subtly to ease his passage, animals pausing to watch him pass with knowing, unafraid eyes. He was no longer just a scribe. He was part of the flow. He reached the outskirts of Ethel as the evening mist began to rise. The town was unrecognizable. The houses were almost entirely submerged in a sea of verdant, alien growth. Trees with bark like braided silk curved over the streets, forming a living canopy. The old church spire was now a trellis for a flowering vine that bloomed with black, star-shaped flowers. The air was thick with the scent of loam and honey. There was no sound of human life, only the gentle rustle of leaves and the soft, almost melodic creaking of the living structures. In the center of town, where the main square had been, the ground had opened up. It was not a chasm, but a wide, shallow basin where the earth had been churned and woven into a vast, complex mandala of roots, soil, and stone. At its center stood the weaver. He was no longer a blurred figure. He was sharp, defined, his form composed of the same fibrous, wooden thread as the trees around him. His eyes were pools of dark, still water, reflecting the twilight sky. Liam walked down into the basin and stood before him. He did not bow. He simply presented his open notebook. The weaver's long, graceful fingers, which were not quite separate from the threads of his own body, touched the pages. A ripple of recognition passed through the ground. Images from Liam's journey, the moss-covered woman, Evan building his cairn, Anya on her rock flowed from the notebook, and into the weaver, into the network itself. The stories were being integrated. The weaver then pointed a single, thread-like finger toward the center of the mandala. A space had been left open, a shape that perfectly matched the contours of a human form. It was an invitation, a completion. Liam felt no fear, only a profound sense of homecoming. This was the final entry. He stepped into the space and lay down. The earth was warm and soft, cradling him. He looked up at the weaver, who now stood over him, his expression one of infinite patience. The weaver raised his hands, and from his fingertips, fine, glowing threads unspooled, dropping down toward Liam. The last thing Liam saw was the intricate pattern of the living canopy above, a tapestry more beautiful than any he had drawn. Then he felt the first gentle touch on his chest, a warmth that spread through him, weaving his flesh, his bones, and his memories into the eternal design. His consciousness did not end. It expanded, flowing out through the root systems, up through the trunks of the trees, becoming one with the quiet hum of the world. The scribe had become the story. The network was whole, and in the deep, patient silence of the woods, it began to dream of new patterns, of threads that would one day stretch far beyond the borders of any map. Story 2. The first thing was the smell of wet earth and roses. It came in through the open window of my small apartment, a thick, cloying perfume that had no business being there. It was October in Maine, and the roses had been dead for a month, killed by the first sharp frost. The earth outside was dry leaves and pine needles, not this rich, black loam scent of a freshly turned garden in high summer. I lay in bed, the smell filling my head, so potent it felt like a taste, like I was breathing in the very essence of decay and bloom all at once. It was the smell of Jeanette's hair the last time I held her, after we made love in the field behind her parents' house, the scent of crushed grass and her shampoo clinging to both of us. That memory, vivid and painful, was the hook that dragged me up from sleep. I swung my legs out of bed, the floorboards cold against my bare feet. The room was gray with pre-dawn light. I shuffled toward the kitchen, my body moving on the dull autopilot of grief, a routine that had sustained me for the 3 months since the accident. It was only when I reached for the coffee tin that I saw my reflection in the dark glass of the window over the sink. There was something wrong with the shape of my head, a distortion in the silhouette against the gray sky. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. I turned on the small fluorescent light above the stove, and then I saw them. They were not large, not yet. Just 2 knobs of bone, dark and rough like ancient driftwood, pushing through the skin just above my temples. A dull, persistent ache bloomed behind my eyes, an ache I now realized had been building for days, a pressure I had mistaken for a hangover of sorrow. I raised a trembling hand. My fingers touched the hard, unyielding texture. It was cold. It was part of me. A sharp, electric jolt of revulsion shot down my spine. I stumbled back from the sink, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was not a dream. The smell of roses and wet earth was still there, clinging to the air, clinging to me. I spent the day in a haze of terror, a prisoner in my own apartment. I called in sick to the garage, my voice a stranger-esque croak. I drew all the blinds, plunging the rooms into a murky twilight. I kept touching the horns, their growth imperceptible to the touch, but undeniable in the mirror. By evening, they were the length of my thumb, curling slightly forward like a young ram. The headache had subsided, replaced by a new sensation, a low hum just at the edge of hearing, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the horns themselves. It was a tuning fork struck against the base of my skull, and it was tuning me to a different frequency. I had to go out. I needed food, and more than that, I needed to know if I was losing my mind. Perhaps this was what grief did, a final, grotesque breakdown. I pulled a worn baseball cap low over my brow, the fabric straining against the new protrusions. The night air was crisp and clean, scoured of the strange floral scent that haunted my apartment. I walked the 3 blocks to Miller S. General Store, my shoulders hunched, my hands shoved deep in my jacket pockets. The bell above the door jangled, a sound ID heard 1,000 times. But this time, it felt like an accusation. Old man Miller was behind the counter, polishing the glass with a rag, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He looked up as I entered, and his eyes, pale and watery, met mine. And then something shifted. His polite, shopkeeper-esque mask seemed to dissolve. His gaze went through me, and a strange, slack expression settled on his face. "Ellis," he said, his voice flat, "I always thought you'd come to a bad end. Your father was a drunk, and your mother, well, the apple doesn't fall far. I sold Jeanette the bottle of wine that night, the one she had in her car. I didn't think nothing of it. She was a good girl. But I saw her with Elias Thorne earlier, down by the river. They looked close. The words hung in the air between us, ugly and final. I stood frozen, a loaf of bread in my hand. Miller's eyes widened, as if he'd just heard his own words played back to him. Color flooded his cheeks. He looked down, suddenly intensely interested in his polishing rag. "Get what you need, Ellis," he muttered, not looking at me again. I left the bread on the shelf and walked out, the bell's jangle sounding like a scream. Elias, my oldest friend, the one who had held me up at the funeral, his arms solid around my shoulders. The one who told me, his voice thick with shared pain, that it was just a terrible accident, a slick road, a moment of bad luck. The hum from the horns grew louder, a resonant note of truth. This was their power. This was my curse. I was a divining rod for secrets, a lightning rod for confession. And the first truth it had drawn out was a lie that had been festering at the heart of my grief. I went to the town diner the next day, a desperate, masochistic experiment. I needed to understand the scope of this affliction. I sat in a booth, the cap pulled down, and ordered coffee. The waitress, Brenda, a woman who had known me since I was a boy, set the cup down. Her fingers brushed mine, and she flinched as if shocked. She stared at me, her eyes losing focus. "My husband hits me," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He says it's because I am stupid. Sometimes I think about putting rat poison in his stew. I've bought it. It's in the shed." She blinked, her professional smile snapping back into place. "Cream and sugar, hun?" she asked, as if nothing had happened. I just nodded, unable to speak. It was like this with everyone. The mailman confessed to stealing pension checks. The pastor admitted he didn't believe in God. The high school sweetheart I hadn't seen in years told me, her voice a hollow monotone, that she had aborted our child a decade ago and never told me. The town's pristine surface, the quiet dignity of a New England community, was a thin sheet of ice over a lake of black, churning secrets. And I was the sun, melting through, revealing the terrible depths beneath. They all saw me, and they were compelled to speak their darkest truths, truths they had hidden from their spouses, their children, themselves. Afterward, they would look at me with a mixture of fear and hatred, as if I had violated them. And I had. The horns did not lie. The smell of roses followed me everywhere now, a personal miasma. It was strongest when the confessions came, a sweet and sickly reward for my unholy communion. I became a ghost in my own town, a creature of shadow and revelation. I stopped going to work. I lived on scraps. My sole purpose became Elias. I had to find him. I had to hear the truth from him. I found him down at the old boat launch on the Kennebec, the place where we skipped stones and dreamed about futures that would never come. He was throwing a stick for his dog, the same Labrador that had been Jeanette's. He saw me approaching and froze. The dog ran to me, wagging its tail, then stopped short, whining and backing away. Elias said. His voice was careful, measured. He was trying to fight it. I could see the struggle in his face, the muscles in his jaw clenching. I took off my cap. The horns were larger now, a good 4 inches, curling like dark thorns. In the flat afternoon light, they seemed to drink the sun. "Tell me about Jeanette," I said. My own voice was raspy from disuse. Elias's eyes glazed over. The fight went out of him. He looked past me at the cold, gray river. "I loved her," he said, and it was the truest thing I'd ever heard him say. "I loved her since we were kids, but she only ever had eyes for you. That night she called me. She was upset. You had a fight. About the future, about leaving this town. She met me here. She was crying. I had a bottle. We drank. I told her you'd never leave, that you were stuck here like your father. I kissed her. She pushed me away. She got in her car. She was crying so hard she could barely see. I let her go. I stood right here and I let her drive away. The world narrowed to the sound of his voice, and the smell of roses, so thick now it was suffocating. The hum in my head was a roar. This was not an accident. This was a betrayal that ended in death. My best friend, my Jeanette. Why, the word was torn from me. A single tear traced a path down Elias's cheek. Because if I couldn't have her, then neither could you. The truth was a physical blow. I stumbled back. The rage that followed was not human. It was a hot, black tide rising from a place the horns had unlocked inside me. I saw myself leaping at him, driving those horns into his throat, feeling his life spill out onto the cold ground. The image was so vivid, so satisfying. But as I took a step forward, a cascade of images flooded my mind, not my own. I saw through Elias's eyes, Jeanette's face, tear-streaked and furious. I felt his desperate, hopeless love. I felt the crushing weight of his guilt, a weight he had carried every day since. It was a vast, dark ocean of pain, and for a moment, I was drowning in it. I did not attack him. I turned and walked away, leaving him weeping by the riverbank. The horns had given me the truth, but they had also given me the terrible, unbearable weight of the truth-bearer. I was not a judge. I was a receptacle, a confessional booth made of flesh and sin. I went to Jeanette's parents' house. I had to see them. I had to know what they knew. Her mother, Maureen, opened the door. She had aged a decade in 3 months. Her eyes, the same shade of hazel as Jeanette's, went wide when she saw me. She didn't seem to notice the horns. She just saw Ellis, the boy who loved her daughter. "Oh, Ellis," she breathed, and pulled me into a hug. The smell of roses in the house was overwhelming, emanating from a dried bouquet on the mantel, Jeanette's favorite. For a moment, in her arms, I was just a grieving boy again. But then the hum began, a low, insistent thrum. Maureen stiffened. She pulled back, her hands on my shoulders, her eyes losing their focus. "I never liked you for her," she whispered, her voice brittle. "I wanted her to marry a doctor, someone from away. I told her you were small town, that you'd keep her small. The night she died, we argued. I said terrible things. I told her she was throwing her life away. Her last words to me were, 'I hate you.' She began to sob, deep, racking sobs that shook her small frame. My baby died hating me. I held her as she cried, the horns on my head feeling like a crown of damnation. I had come seeking answers, but all I was doing was spreading poison, drawing out the rot that grief had fertilized. This was not power. This was a pestilence. I don't know how long I wandered after that. Days bled into nights. The horns grew heavier, their curl more pronounced. The hum was a constant companion, a symphony of the town's hidden self-loathing and desire. I was a ghost, a monster, a saint of sorrow. I could no longer distinguish the smell of roses from the smell of my own decaying hope. My mind began to unravel, the constant barrage of truths too heavy a burden for any single soul to carry. The present became a thin, painful layer over the past. I would be walking down the street, and suddenly I would be 7 years old, sitting on the porch with my father, the smell of his beer sharp in the air. I would be 16, kissing Jeanette for the first time behind the school, the taste of her lip gloss like strawberries. The memories were not comforting, they were sharp and broken, cutting me as they surfaced. The horns were pulling everything out, not just the secrets of others, but my own history, my own soul. Layer by layer, I found myself at the edge of the field behind Jeanette's house, the place where the smell had first come from. The field was dead and brown, but the scent of roses was so powerful here, it was a physical presence. I fell to my knees. The hum in my head was not a hum anymore. It was a voice, 1,000 voices, all whispering their truths at once, a cacophony of sin that threatened to split my skull. I clawed at the horns, but they were fused to the bone, a part of me as essential as my own heart. And then the final regression began. The world dissolved. The voices faded. I was no longer Ellis, the man with horns. I was a boy running through a summer field, the sun warm on my back. Jeanette was there, her laughter like bells on the wind. She was calling my name, not Ellis, a different name, a name from before, a name I could almost remember. The grass was green, so green it hurt to look at, and the sky was an endless, forgiving blue. There were no secrets here, no truths, no horns. There was only the light, and the sound of her laughter, and the feeling of running, forever running, toward a horizon that never got any closer, the smell of roses leading me on, and on, and on, into a past that was simpler and safer, and forever lost. The sun was a different sun then, a kinder one. It soaked into my skin, into the cotton of my t-shirt, and the world was made of simple things. The feel of the earth under my sneakers, the buzz of insects in the tall grass, the distant call of my mother from the back porch. But strongest of all was Jeanette's voice, a thread of pure joy pulling me forward. I ran until my lungs burned, my small legs pumping, chasing the red flash of her hair through the stalks of goldenrod and Queen Anne's lace. That other life, the one with the horns and the grief, was a bad dream, a shadow I could outrun. Here, there was no Elias, no accident, no wait. There was only the promise of catching her, of the game we were playing, a game whose rules I could no longer recall, but whose importance was absolute. I burst into the small clearing where the old oak stood, its branches a sprawling canopy. She was waiting for me, leaning against the rough bark, her face flushed and smiling. She wasn't the woman I had lost. She was the girl I had grown up with, all scabby knees and fierce green eyes. "You race slow," she teased, her voice the same one that had called me from the edge of sleep. I tried to speak, to answer her with a boast of my own speed, but my voice was gone. The words stuck in my throat, thick and foreign. The scene before me wavered, like a reflection on water disturbed by a stone. For a terrifying second, I saw two images superimposed: the vibrant, living girl and the ghost of the woman in the casket, her skin too pale, her hair too perfectly still. A coldness seeped into the summer air. The hum returned, not in my head, but in the ground beneath my feet, a vibration that made the blades of grass shiver. Jeanette S.'s smile faltered. Her eyes, once bright with mischief, widened. She was no longer looking at me, but at a point just above my forehead. "Ellis," she whispered, and the name was wrong. It was the name from the other world, the world of the horns. "What S on your head?" I reached up. My small boy S fingers touched not the soft hair of a child, but the hard, cold, familiar texture of the horns. They were there, even here. They had followed me into my own past. The field dissolved. The sun vanished, replaced by the flat, gray light of a Maine afternoon. I was on my knees in the dead grass, the cold seeping through my jeans. The smell of roses was now a stench, a cloying sweetness that spoke of death, not life. The hum was a roar again, the voices of the town screaming in my mind. I had not escaped. I had only fallen deeper into the labyrinth of my own damnation. I looked toward Jeanette S.'s house. The memory of her Mother S. confession was a fresh wound. I had to go back. I had to see if the truth I had pulled from her had broken her completely. It was a morbid need, a compulsion driven by the very curse that was consuming me. I was no longer seeking answers. I was simply drawn to the pain, a moth to a flame. I walked back to the house, my body moving with a heavy, mechanical grace. The front door was still unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The silence was different now. It was a thick, waiting silence. The dried roses on the mantel seemed to have withered further in the short time I had been gone, their petals turning to dust. "Maureen," I called out, my voice echoing in the small, tidy living room. There was no answer. I walked through to the kitchen. It was empty, a single cup of tea sitting cold on the table. A dread began to coil in my stomach, cold and sharp. I climbed the stairs, each step a monumental effort. The door to her parents' bedroom was ajar. I pushed it open. Maureen was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at a photograph in her hands. It was a picture of Jeanette at her high school graduation, her smile blindingly bright. Maureen, didn't he look up as I entered? Her face was eerily calm, all the earlier emotion drained away. "She hated me," she said, her voice flat and empty. "You showed me that. You made me see it." "I didn't make you see anything," I said, the words tasting like ash. "The horns, they just what?" she interrupted, finally lifting her gaze to me. Her eyes were dry and hollow. "They just force the truth out. Do you think that is a gift, Ellis? Or is it just a more cruel kind of punishment?" She stood up, placing the photograph carefully on the bedside table. "I can live with that truth. I was already hanging by a thread. You cut it." She walked past me, her shoulder brushing against mine. A jolt passed through me, and another memory, not mine, flashed behind my eyes. Maureen, young and hopeful, holding a baby Jeanette for the first time. A love so fierce it was terrifying. Then it was gone. I followed her downstairs, a silent, helpless witness. She went to the kitchen sink and turned on the tap, filling a glass with water. Her movements were precise, deliberate. She opened a cabinet and took out a small, brown prescription bottle. She shook 2 pills into her palm, then paused and shook out several more. "Danti," I pleaded, but the word was weak. The horns on my head felt like anchors, rooting me to the spot. I was the catalyst, but I had no power to stop the reaction I had started. She looked at me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the woman who had hugged me at the door. "It's not your fault," she said, and it was the most painful confession of all, because it was a lie. We both knew it was my fault. The horns knew it. They hummed in agreement. She swallowed the pills with a sip of water, then walked into the living room and sat down in her armchair, folding her hands in her lap as if waiting for a guest. She closed her eyes. I stood there, watching, as the last bit of light faded from the room, and the silence deepened into something absolute. The only sound was the low, incessant hum of the horns, a sound that was now the only thing left in the world. I had come for the truth, and I had been given it, and it had cost everything. I do not know how long I stood there in the darkening room. The line between Maureen's breathing and the silence was so fine, I could not mark its passing. The hum of the horns was the only pulse in the house. I was a statue in a museum of my own making, a monument to truth and its consequences. Eventually, a car door slammed outside. Tires crunched on the gravel drive. It was Frank, Jeanette's father, returning from his shift at the mill. The sound broke my paralysis. To be found here, with Maureen like that, with me like this, it was unthinkable. I moved on limbs that were not my own, slipping out the back door just as the front door opened. I heard Frank's cheerful, weary call. "Maureen, I brought a pie." The silence that answered him was a sound I would carry forever. I ran, not with purpose, but with the blind, panicked instinct of a wounded animal. I crashed through the barren field, the thorns of dead bushes tearing at my clothes. The horns on my head felt immense, a weight that threatened to pitch me forward with every step. The world was a smear of gray and brown. I did not stop until I reached the river, the same stretch of water where Elias had confessed. I fell to my knees on the muddy bank, retching. but nothing came up. There was nothing left inside me. The water was black and slow-moving. In its reflection, I saw a monster. The horns were unmistakable, curling up from my brow like something from a forgotten myth. My face was gaunt, my eyes sunk deep into shadows. I was not a man. I was a thing, an instrument of ruin. A new compulsion seized me, simple and clear. I had to get rid of them. I grabbed at the base of the horn on my right temple, my fingers slipping on the smooth, hard surface. I pulled with all my strength, a guttural cry tearing from my throat. A white-hot pain shot through my skull, so intense I saw stars. It was like trying to pull out my own spine. They were part of me, fused to the bone, grown from the seed of whatever sin had spawned them. Defeated, I slumped back, clutching my head. The pain was a clarifying fire. There was no going back. There was no undoing this. Miller, Brenda, the pastor, Elias, Maureen I had opened a vein of poison in this town, and it was spreading. I was a plague. The only way to stop it was to remove the source. I had to leave. I had to get away from everyone I had ever known, from every memory that could trigger this awful power. I had to go where there were no secrets left for me to hear, because the next confession I drew out might be the one that finally broke the world, or what was left of me. I stood up, my body aching. I turned my back on the river and began the long walk into town. I kept my head down, the brim of my cap pulled low, but it was a futile gesture. The streets were deserted as I approached my apartment over the old hardware store. The town seemed to sense my presence and shrink from it. Curtains twitched closed as I passed. Inside my apartment, the air was stale and cold. I filled a duffel bag with whatever I could find, a few changes of clothes, the little cash I had left. I left behind the photos, the books, the life of Ellis. It belonged to a ghost. As I turned to leave, my eyes fell on the one thing I had not packed. On the small table by the door lay the loaf of bread from Miller S. store, still in its thin paper wrapper. I had taken it with me that first day without thinking. It was hard as a stone now, a symbol of a kindness that had curdled into something else entirely. I left it there. I walked to the edge of town as night fell. I did not look back. I stuck out my thumb on the highway heading west, away from the sea, away from the memories. A trucker in a big rig slowed and stopped. I climbed into the passenger seat. The man was large, friendly-looking, with a kind face. "Where you headed, son?" he asked, pulling back onto the road. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. The hum began, a low, threatening vibration. The smell of roses bloomed inside the cab, thick and sweet. The trucker's kind eyes glazed over. His hands tightened on the wheel. "I killed a man once," he said, his voice a flat, dead thing. "Back in '98. An argument over a poker game. I hit him with a tire iron. I buried him out in the desert outside Reno. I got a wife and 3 kids in Portland who Don T know nothing about it. He fell silent. The professional smile returned to his face. "So," he said, as if beginning the conversation anew, "you got a destination in mind." I looked out the window at the dark, rushing trees. There was no destination. There was only flight. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the marrow, that the horns would always find a voice. They would always draw out the truth, and I would always be there to hear it. The road stretched out ahead, an endless gray ribbon leading into the heart of a country full of secrets. My curse was my compass. The truck rumbled on through the night. The steady drone of the engine, a poor mask for the screaming silence between us. I kept my face turned to the window, watching my own monstrous reflection float over the dark landscape. The trucker, whose name was Dave, tried to make conversation a few more times, but each attempt died in his throat after a single sentence. The confession hung in the air between us, a ghost that only I could see. After an hour, he pulled into a brightly lit truck stop. The neon signs buzzed against the black sky. "Gonna grab some coffee. Use the facilities," he said, not looking at me. "You want anything?" I just shook my head. The moment he was gone, I slid out of the cab, my duffel bag hitting the pavement with a soft thud. I couldn't stay with him. My presence was a violation. I walked away from the lights, towards the dark end of the parking lot where the shadows were deep. I huddled against the cold metal side of a storage container, the smell of diesel and grease, a welcome relief from the phantom scent of roses. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, a sharp voice cut through the haze. "You can't sleep here." A security guard stood a few feet away. A flashlight beam pointed at the ground near my feet. He was an older man, with a tired face and a badge that gleamed under the lot's lights. The hum started instantly, a low warning growl in my skull. I pulled my cap down further. "Sorry," I mumbled, starting to stand. "I was just waiting for a ride." The guard took a step closer. "Let me see your face, son." I looked up. The flashlight beam hit my eyes, then traveled upward. His expression shifted from weary authority to stunned confusion. The hum intensified. The smell of roses, faint at first, then overpowering. His mouth opened slightly. "I stole from my own brother," he whispered, the words tumbling out as if pulled by a string. "After our mom died, I took his share of the inheritance. He lost his house. He doesn't talk to me anymore. My kids don't know their uncle because of me." He blinked, shaking his head as if to clear it. The professional demeanor snapped back into place. "Now move along. This is private property." I stumbled away, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was getting worse. The threshold was lower. It didn't require a conversation anymore, just a glance, a moment of connection. I was a walking trigger. I spent the rest of the night walking along the highway's shoulder, the roar of passing trucks buffeting me. By dawn, I was in another town, a place I'd never been. The streets were waking up. A woman was unlocking a diner. A mailman was starting his route. I was so tired, so hollowed out, that the hum was a constant, dull ache I went into the diner, the bell on the door jangling. I took a seat at the counter, as far from the other customers as possible. A waitress with kind eyes and a coffee pot came over. "What can I get you, hun?" she asked. I opened my mouth to order coffee. Nothing came out. The hum spiked. The smell of roses filled my nostrils. Her kind eyes went distant. "My son," she said, her voice barely audible. "He's in prison. I tell people he's working on an oil rig. I send him money every month. I lie to my husband." She poured the coffee without looking, the dark liquid sloshing over the rim of the cup. Then she moved down the counter, her smile back in place for the next customer. I left a $5 bill on the counter and walked out. The coffee sat there, steaming and untouched. I understood now. There was no escape. Every person was a locked box of pain, and I was the key. I could no more stop this than I could stop my own heart from beating. The horns weren't just a part of me, they were me. Ellis was gone. What remained was this vessel, this confessional on two legs, doomed to walk the earth and listen. The road ahead was infinite, and every mile would be paved with the secrets of strangers. I started walking again, my shadow stretching long and twisted in the morning sun. There was no destination. There was only the next confession, and the next, and the next. The sun climbed higher, baking the asphalt and filling the air with a wavering heat. I walked until my feet were raw inside my shoes. The highway cut through a forest of pine, a straight gray line that seemed to lead to nowhere. Cars and trucks blew past, their wakes pulling at my clothes. I kept my head down, a silent plea for invisibility. By midday, the thirst was a rasping thing in my throat. I saw a sign for a roadside rest area a mile ahead. A place with water and shade. A risk. But the need for water was a physical demand that overshadowed the dread. I trudged toward it. It was a small, paved loop with picnic tables under wooden shelters and a brick building housing restrooms. A family was unpacking a cooler at one table, the children laughing and chasing each other. An older couple sat in folding chairs, reading. I went to the water fountain, drinking greedily, the cold water a shock to my system. I cupped my hands and splashed my face, the water dripping from my chin and spotting the concrete. I felt a presence and turned. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, had broken away from her family and was standing a few feet away, staring at me with the unblinking curiosity of a child. She held a doll by one leg. I froze. The hum began, a soft, rising tone. No, I thought, not a child. Please, not a child. Her mother noticed and called out, "Sarah, leave the man alone." But Sarah didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on my forehead, just under the brim of my cap. She tilted her head. The hum grew louder, a high-pitched whine now. The scent of roses was suddenly everywhere, sweet and suffocating. The little girl's face scrunched up, not in fear, but in confusion. "You have always," she said, her voice clear and loud. Her mother was walking over, an apologetic smile on her face. "I'm so sorry," She has no filter. The little girl pointed a stubby finger at me. On your head. The owies look like puppy dog ears. The mother was closer now. The hum was a scream in my skull. I saw the woman S smile falter as she got near, her eyes losing their focus for a fraction of a second. Her steps slowed. A secret was right there, poised on her lips, drawn up by the terrible gravity of my presence. I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let this innocence be shattered. I did the only thing I could think of. I turned and ran. I crashed into the woods behind the rest area, branches whipping at my face, my duffel bag catching on thorns. I ran until the sound of the highway was a distant whisper, and the only thing I could hear was my own ragged breath and the relentless, accusing hum. I had run from a little girl. I was a monster who frightened children. The truth was no longer something I exposed. It was a disease I carried, and I was contagious. I leaned against a rough-barked pine, my chest heaving. The forest floor was a carpet of brown needles, swallowing the sound of my panic. The child S words echoed in my mind. Puppy dog ears. To her, the horns were just a strange injury, something to be noted with a child S blunt honesty. She hadn't seen the monster. Not yet. But her mother had been on the verge of seeing everything. This was the new pattern. The curse was refining itself, becoming more efficient. It no longer waited for emotional vulnerability or a shared moment. It required only proximity. A glance was enough. A few feet of shared air. I was a leaky vessel, and the truth was the poison seeping out. I couldn't go back to the highway. I was a danger to anyone in a moving vehicle, a potential cause of a catastrophic accident. I had to stay away from people. But the world was made of people. My stomach growled, a hollow ache that underscored my isolation. Thirst was one thing, hunger was another. I had a little money, but walking into a store was an unimaginable risk. I spent the day moving parallel to the highway, deep enough in the trees to be unseen. As evening drew in, I saw the lights of a small town twinkling in the valley below. A supermarket stood at the edge of it, a large, impersonal box. It was my best chance. Under the flat, fluorescent lights, surrounded by strangers focused on their own errands, I might be able to pass through unnoticed. A ghost. I waited until full dark, then approached from the back, slipping across the parking lot with my head down. The automatic doors hissed open. The air inside was cold and smelled of sanitizer and wax. I grabbed a hand basket, my knuckles white on the plastic handle. The hum was present, a steady, low-grade warning. I moved quickly, my eyes on the linoleum floor. I grabbed a loaf of bread, a block of cheese, a few bottles of water. Every person was a potential landmine. A man comparing soup cans. A woman reaching for cereal. I kept my distance, weaving through the aisles like a thief. I made it to the checkout line. There was only one lane open, manned by a teenage boy with acne and a bored expression. My heart hammered. This was the moment of greatest danger. A prolonged, direct interaction. I placed my items on the conveyor belt, keeping my face turned away. The boy scanned the bread, the cheese. Didn't he look at me? That LLB 1450, he mumbled, staring at the screen. I fumbled the cash from my pocket, thrusting a 20 toward him. Our fingers brushed as he took it. The contact was electric. The hum spiked into a shriek. The boy's head snapped up. His bored eyes widened, glazing over. The scent of roses was so strong I thought I would vomit. I changed the grades on my report cards. He whispered, his voice robotic. I've been doing it for 2 years. My parents think I am getting BS. I am failing everything. I don't know how to tell them. He blinked, then looked down at the money in his hand. He gave me my change, his movements slow and confused. Have a good night, he said, the words empty. I snatched the plastic bag and almost ran from the store. I had stolen a boy's secret, a small, mundane terror, and it felt like a violation worse than any of the others. It was so pointless, so cruel. I didn't stop until I was back in the safety of the woods. I sat on the ground, tearing at the bread and cheese, eating without tasting. The food was ash in my mouth. The boy's confession played on a loop in my head. I had become a parasite, feeding on the hidden shames of others simply by existing. There was no purpose to it, no grand design. It was just a random, vicious curse. I was a wound in the world, and every person I met was salt rubbed into it. The road was no longer an escape. It was just a longer path between moments of pain. The cheese turned to a thick, gluey paste in my mouth. I forced it down, washing it away with gulps of tepid water. The darkness under the trees was absolute now, a solid thing pressing in. I could still see the supermarket's lights through the branches, a distant galaxy of normalcy I was forever exiled from. Sleep was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth was a person approaching. My own body had become a trap. I sat with my back against a tree, the duffel bag on my lap, and waited for the night to pass. The hum had receded to its usual background drone, a constant reminder of the infection I carried. When the sky began to lighten from black to a deep, bruised gray, I started walking again. I followed a creek away from the town, away from the highway. I had no plan other than to put distance between myself and the possibility of human contact. The land began to rise, the gentle foothills giving way to steeper, rockier slopes. The air grew cooler. For 2 days, I lived like an animal. I drank from the creek. I ate the last of the bread and cheese, and then I ate nothing. The hunger was a dull, constant companion to the fear. The horns felt heavier than ever, a crown of lead. On the 3rd day, I found a dirt road, little more than a pair of ruts carved into the earth. It led upward into the mountains. Desperation outweighed caution. A road, even a forgotten one, might lead to a hunting cabin, a shed, somewhere I could find a can of food left behind. The road climbed for hours, winding through dense stands of fir and aspen. The silence was different here, not empty, but full, of the natural sounds of the wilderness. For the first time since leaving the town, the hum inside me seemed to quiet, as if soothed by the lack of human resonance. It was a fragile piece, but I clung to it. Just as the sun was dipping behind the western peaks, I saw a structure. It was a small, dilapidated cabin tucked into a clearing, its roof sagging, and one window boarded up. A chimney made of river stones stood at one end. It looked abandoned. Hope, a dangerous and forgotten feeling, flickered in my chest. I approached slowly, my senses screaming. The door was unlocked. It creaked open on rusted hinges. The single room was dark and smelled of dust and dry rot. A rusty wood stove sat in one corner, a bare cot frame in another. It was empty. It was perfect. I dropped my duffel bag inside the door and sank to the floor, exhaustion washing over me in a wave. For a few precious moments, I felt something like relief. This could be a way. Isolation. A life lived apart, where I could harm no one. The sound of an engine shattered the silence. It was a low growl, getting closer. I scrambled to my feet and peered through a crack in the boarded-up window. A beat-up pickup truck, coated in dust, was bumping its way up the road. It stopped in front of the cabin. The door opened, and a man got out. He was old, his face a roadmap of wrinkles under a wide-brimmed hat. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who knew the land. He was looking right at the cabin, right at me. My heart seized. The hum returned, not as a warning, but as a full-blown siren. The smell of roses bloomed in the dusty air of the cabin, sickly sweet. There was no back door, no way out. The old man walked toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the gravel. Didn't he look angry, just curious? He pushed the door open and stood in the frame, his eyes taking a moment to adjust to the dim light. They found me, cowering in the corner. Didn't he startle? Didn't he scream? He just looked at me, his gaze steady. It traveled from my face to the horns on my head. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. The confession was coming. I could feel it building in the air, a pressure about to break. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the old man's life to be torn open. But he just took off his hat and held it in his hands. Figured I'd find someone up here eventually, he said, his voice gravelly but calm. Place has been empty 10 years. He looked around the cabin, then back at me. His eyes were clear. There was no glaze, no distant look. The hum remained, but it was muted, confused. You Ray not going to tell me anything, I whispered, the words tasting strange. The old man almost smiled. Son, he said, I've been talking to these mountains for 70 years. I got no secrets left they don't already know. He stepped fully inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. The cabin seemed to shrink with his presence. He didn't come any closer, just leaned against the wall by the door, his eyes never leaving me. The hum was a persistent vibration, but it was different. It wasn't pulling. It was just there, like like a dog that had growled, but now only whined, confused by a lack of threat. "You're the one they're all whispering about down in the valley," he said, not as an accusation, but a statement of fact. "Saw the news on a TV in the general store. Missing person. Ellis Wright." I flinched at the sound of my name. It felt like a relic from another life. "They think you're a victim, but you're not, are you?" He gestured vaguely toward my head with his hat. "You're the thing that happens." I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. "Name's Jeremiah," he said. "This is my land. My grandfather built this cabin." He looked around again, a fond sadness in his eyes. "It's got a good roof still. The stove works if you know how to bank the coals." He finally pushed himself off the wall and walked to the wood stove, running a hand over its rusty top. "I come up here every few weeks to check on things." Saw the door was open. "I'm sorry," I managed to croak. "I didn't know. I'll go." "Go where?" Jeremiah asked, turning to face me. His gaze was direct, but it didn't trigger the awful compulsion. He was like a rock in a river. The current of my curse simply flowed around him. "You plan on walking till you die. That's a long, hard way to go. What choice do I have?" The question was a plea. "I can't be around people. You saw what happens. You must feel it." "I feel something," he admitted, "a pressure, like a storm coming. But my secrets are my own. They're old and they're settled. You can't stir up what's already at the bottom of the lake." He studied me for a long moment. "You're hungry." It wasn't a question. He could see it in the hollows of my cheeks, the tremor in my hands. I nodded again, ashamed. Jeremiah walked to the door. "I'll be back," he said. "Don't you go anywhere." He paused with his hand on the knob. "And don't touch my stove. You'll smoke yourself out." Then he was gone. The truck door slammed, the engine coughed to life, and the sound faded down the mountain. I slid down the wall to the floor, my mind reeling. He had looked at me. He had spoken to me. And he had walked away whole. It was the first impossible thing that had happened since the horns grew. The sun had set by the time I heard the truck returning. My every instinct screamed to hide, but I forced myself to stay seated. The headlights swept across the cabin front before cutting out. Jeremiah came back in, carrying a cardboard box. He set it on the floor beside me. Inside was a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, a few cans of beans, and a canteen of water. "There's a can opener in there," he said. "Eat." I didn't need to be told twice. I tore into the bread and peanut butter, eating like I'd never seen food before. Jeremiah watched, saying nothing. When I finally slowed down, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand, he spoke again. "You can stay here," he said. "For a while. It's quiet. No one comes up this way but me." Why, the word was thick with peanut butter and disbelief. "Why would you help me?" "Because the mountain is lonely," he said simply. "And it's not a place for a man to die alone." He turned and walked back to the door. "I'll be back in a week. If you're gone, I'll understand. If you're here, I'll bring more supplies." He left without another word. I listened until the sound of his truck disappeared completely, leaving only the whisper of the wind in the pines. For the first time in weeks, the hum inside me was quiet, not gone, but dormant. In the profound silence of the mountain night, surrounded by the food he had brought, I felt a sensation I thought I'd lost forever. It wasn't hope. It was a respite, a temporary ceasefire in a war I didn't start. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The next morning, I woke with the sun, my body stiff from the hard floor. The cabin was cold, but the silence was a blanket. No hum, just the chatter of a squirrel on the roof and the wind. I ate more bread and peanut butter, rationing it in my mind. A week was a long time. I spent the day exploring the clearing. There was an old rain barrel, half full of murky water. I found a path leading to a creek, its water clear and icy cold. I drank until my stomach ached and washed the grime from my face and hands. The cold was a shock, but it felt clean. For the first time, I looked at my reflection in a still pool. The face that stared back was gaunt, a stranger-esque face. The horns were undeniable, curling up from my forehead like dark, petrified roots. But here, with no one to see them, they were just a part of the landscape of my face. A fact, not a curse. The days fell into a simple rhythm. I slept on the cot frame, using my duffel bag as a pillow. I learned to use the wood stove, burning small sticks to take the edge off the mountain chill. I stayed near the cabin, afraid to venture too far and risk missing Jeremiah. The solitude was a healing balm. The constant tension in my shoulders began to ease. The hum remained a quiet undercurrent, a part of my blood now, but it no longer felt like a scream waiting to happen. On the 7th day, I heard the truck. The familiar rumble sent a jolt through me, a mix of anticipation and fear. What if he had changed his mind? What if last time was a fluke? I stood in the doorway as he parked. He got out, carrying another box and a rolled-up bundle under his arm. He nodded to me as he approached. "You Ray still here?" "I am," I said, my voice less ragged than before. He set the box inside. It held more food, a bag of coffee, and a thick wool blanket. He unrolled the bundle. It was a sleeping bag, faded and patched, but clean. "Nights are getting colder," he said by way of explanation. He didn't stay long. He checked the roof, kicked the foundation logs, and nodded to himself. "Place is holding up." He turned to leave, then stopped. "You need a haircut." My hand flew to my head. My hair was long, matted. I hadn't thought about it. "Next time," he said, and got in his truck. And so it continued. Every week, Jeremiah would appear. He never asked questions. He brought supplies, made small remarks about the weather or the cabin, and left. Sometimes he would stay for 10 minutes, sometimes only 5. It was a transaction, but it was also a ritual, a confirmation that I still existed. One afternoon, he arrived with a pair of rusty clippers. "Sit on that stump," he commanded. I obeyed. The hum stirred as he stood behind me, but it remained quiet, respectful. The sound of the clippers was loud in the clearing. Tufts of my dark hair fell to the ground. He worked quickly, efficiently. When he was done, he handed me a small, cracked mirror. The man looking back was still thin, still marked, but he looked less wild. The horns were more exposed, but also more a part of a whole face. Better, Jeremiah grunted. He packed up the clippers. You look less like a ghost. That was the greatest kindness anyone had shown me since this began. He saw me. He acknowledged my existence without forcing me to destroy his. As his truck disappeared down the mountain road, I ran my hand over the short bristles of my hair. I felt grounded, real. The monster was still there, but the man was re-emerging piece by piece in the quiet space Jeremiah had made for him. The road was far below, and the world with it. Here there was only the mountain, the cabin, and the weekly visit from an old man who knew the value of silence. It wasn't freedom, but it was a life. And for now, that was everything. The following week, Jeremiah did not come on the usual day. The sun rose and set, and the only sound was the wind. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. Had something happened to him? Or had he finally decided the risk was too great, the burden too heavy? I tried to quiet the panic by busying myself, stacking firewood, sweeping the cabin floor with a bundle of pine needles. But the silence felt different now. It was no longer peaceful, but expectant and heavy with absence. On the third day, I heard the engine. The relief was so physical I had to lean against the doorframe. The truck looked the same, but when Jeremiah stepped out, I saw immediately that something was wrong. He moved slower, his face pale and drawn. He carried no box. He walked to the cabin and for a long moment just looked at me. "The world is getting closer, son," he said, his voice rough. "They found a car abandoned 50 miles from here. They're searching the area." The hum inside me, which had been so quiet, surged with a sharp, metallic taste of fear. I could feel it pushing against the quiet space around Jeremiah. He winced, just slightly, and put a hand to his temple. "It's getting harder to keep it out," he said, not looking at me. "The older I get, the thinner my walls are." He finally met my eyes. "They'll come up this mountain eventually. Hunters, hikers. You can't stay here forever." "I know," I whispered. The fragile peace of the last few weeks shattered around me. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was just a hiding place, and a temporary one. Jeremiah was silent for a long time, looking past me into the dark woods. "There's a place," he said finally, "further up. A cave system in the high peaks. My father showed me when I was a boy. Hard to get to. No one goes there." He looked back at me, his gaze intense. "It's a harder life, but it's a deeper silence." He didn't need to say more. I understood the choice. Stay here and wait for discovery, or follow him into a true wilderness. I nodded. "Show me." We left that afternoon. I gathered my few things, the sleeping bag, the canteen, the remaining food into the duffel bag. I took one last look at the cabin that had sheltered me. Then I got into the passenger seat of Jeremiah's truck. It was the first time I had been in a vehicle since my escape. The closeness was terrifying. The hum buzzed angrily in the confined space, and the scent of roses was a faint, threatening perfume. Jeremiah gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, and drove in silence. We drove for an hour up logging roads that became little more than goat trails. When the truck could go no further, we got out and started walking. Jeremiah set a brutal pace, not looking back. I struggled to keep up, my legs weak from weeks of inactivity, the duffel bag feeling like a ton of bricks. The air grew thin and cold. As dusk began to settle, he stopped at the base of a sheer rock face covered in scree and stubborn pines. "There," he said, pointing to what looked like a shadow between two massive boulders. It was the entrance to the cave. It was smaller than I had imagined, a dark mouth in the stone. He handed me a heavy flashlight from his pack. "I can't go in with you," he said. There was no apology in his voice, only a final, stark truth. "I understand," I said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a hunting knife in a leather sheath. He held it out, for protection, from animals. I took it. The weight of it in my hand was sobering. "This is as far as I can take you," Jeremiah said. He looked old and tired in the fading light. The mountains he loved seemed to loom over him, accepting his return. "The silence up here, it's different. It might be enough." He turned to go. "Jeremiah," I called out. He stopped but didn't turn back. "Thank you." He just raised a hand in a slow, silent gesture of acknowledgement. Then he started down the path, his figure quickly swallowed by the trees. I was alone again, but this time the solitude felt absolute. I turned on the flashlight and stepped into the cave. The beam illuminated a narrow passage that opened into a wider chamber. The air was still and ancient, and for the first time since the horns grew, the hum inside me went completely, utterly silent. The void it left behind was terrifying, and vast and peaceful. Story 3. The first thing he noticed, in the gray light that was not quite dawn, was that the road had grown wider. It was not a thought that arrived with any fanfare, no sudden shock of realization. It was more like a slow, cold seep of water into a boot, a discomfort that announced itself only by its persistence. Chris lay on his back, the hard-packed earth a familiar ache against his spine, and stared at the cracked asphalt ribbon unfurling into the mist. Yesterday, the gap between the skeletal trees on either side had been a comfortable 20 yards, a corridor they had trudged down for hours. This morning, it looked like a river delta, a vast, gray plain of broken tar that stretched for what seemed like 100 yards to the tree line. The trees themselves appeared smaller, more distant, like a child's toys placed carefully on a shelf at the far end of a long room. He blinked, the grit of a poor night's sleep scratching at his eyes. He tried to measure it against a memory, the width of the main street back in the town they left behind a lifetime ago. But that street was a dream, its proportions softened and warped by hunger and time. This was different. This was a physical wrongness, a silent, geometric betrayal. The world was not supposed to do this. It was supposed to remain constant, a fixed stage for their suffering. This subtle stretching of space felt like a deeper, more fundamental unraveling. A small, warm weight shifted against his side. Gregory. The boy was still asleep, his breath a faint plume in the chill, his face pale and smudged with dirt. He had burrowed deep into their shared sleeping bag, a cocoon of thin synthetic fabric that was their only defense against the creeping cold. Chris watched the steady rise and fall of his son's narrow chest, a metronome counting out the seconds of their continued existence. The love he felt was a physical pain. A hook lodged deep behind his sternum, pulling him forward when every other part of him screamed to lie down and let the silence take him. He sat up slowly, the joints in his back and knees complaining with a series of pops and creaks. The air tasted of ash and damp rot, a permanent flavor now, the taste of the world itself. He listened. There was only the wind, a low moan through the pine needles, and the occasional drip of condensation from the plastic sheet he had rigged as a lean-to. No birds, no insects. The silence was the loudest thing. They had been walking for 47 days. He kept a tally, a series of faint scratches on the metal frame of his backpack, a ritual as meaningless and essential as prayer. South, always south. The story passed from one desperate soul to another in the charred remains of a trading post, was of a place where the ashfall had been lighter, where a thin sun still warmed the earth, and where things might still grow. A place called, with a bleak, utilitarian hope, the green. It was a fairy tale, he knew, but a fairy tale was a better thing to carry than nothing at all. He shook Gregory's shoulder gently. The boy's eyes opened instantly. There was no slow, groggy transition from sleep to wakefulness, not anymore. His eyes were old eyes, a deep, watchful brown that had seen too much. They scanned the lean-to, the road, his father's face, assessing, always assessing. Time, Gregory's voice was a rasp, thin as paper. Time to go, Chris said, his own voice a gravelly echo. They packed their meager possessions with the efficiency of long practice. The sleeping bag rolled tight, the empty canteens, the knife, the little tin cup. Chris checked the pistol, a heavy, cold thing he hated the feel of. 2 rounds left. He kept that fact from Gregory. 2 rounds were a promise or a threat. He wasn't sure which anymore. They stepped out onto the road. The mist clung to them, wet and cold. Chris looked back the way they had come. The road seemed to narrow behind them, converging to a point in the gray distance like an optical illusion. He looked ahead. It was still impossibly wide. He decided not to mention it to Gregory. The boy had enough to carry. They walked. The rhythm of their footsteps was the only music left in the world. The crunch of Chris's heavy boots, the lighter scuff of Gregory's worn sneakers. The forest on either side was a wall of gray, the trees bare and blackened, their branches like cracks in the sky. Sometimes they passed the husks of cars, sitting on flat, rusted tires, their windows gaping holes filled with dead leaves and shadows. Chris never let Gregory look inside for long. You never knew what you might find curled up in the dark. What might have chosen a metal coffin for its final rest? The wrongness of the road persisted. It would feel normal for an hour, the trees a comfortable distance away, and then Chris would glance up and see that the opposite tree line had receded, a distant shore across a sea of asphalt. Or the road would seem to climb a hill that was far too long, its crest never getting any closer, until suddenly they were at the top, and the descent was abrupt, jarring. It was a subtle nausea, a vertigo of perception. He began to feel like an ant on a vast, cracked plate. Around midday, they found a stream, little more than a trickle of brown water between mossy stones. They filtered it carefully through a cloth, the water emerging only slightly less brown. They drank in silence, the metallic taste a small blessing. Gregory sat on a rock, his small frame looking even smaller against the immense, wounded landscape. He was looking at his hands. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet. "Yeah, buddy. My fingers feel longer." Chris S. blood went cold. He looked at his son S. hands. They were a child S. hands, dirty, the nails broken. But were they? He tried to see them as they were yesterday, as they had been a week ago. He couldn't see the bones seemed more prominent, the spaces between the knuckles deeper. It could be hunger. It could be the light. He forced a smile, a cracked, painful thing. "It's just the cold," he said. "Makes everything feel strange." Gregory looked at him, those old eyes seeing right through the lie. But he nodded, a small, accepting motion. He had learned not to question the small horrors. It was the big ones you had to save your fear for. They moved on. The afternoon sun was a dull silver coin behind the perpetual haze. The shadows began to stretch, but they stretched wrong. They were too long, too thin, like taffy pulled across the ground. Chris watched his own shadow, a gaunt giant striding ahead of him, its head sometimes disappearing over the crest of a hill they had not yet reached. He felt a profound disconnection, as if his body and his shadow were only loosely tethered. They saw their first sign of other people since the previous week, a figure far ahead in the middle of the road. Chris stopped immediately, pulling Gregory behind the skeleton of an old delivery truck. He peered through a broken window. The figure was motionless, a dark stain against the gray. It was impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman, friend or foe. Distance had become untrustworthy. The figure could have been 100 yards away, or 500. It seemed to shimmer, its edges blurring in the thick air. They waited for an hour, not moving, not speaking. The figure did not move. Finally, Chris decided to risk a wide detour through the woods. The ground was soft and sucking, covered in a carpet of brown needles. The trees were too quiet. As they circled around, Chris kept looking back at the figure. It never changed. It was just a shape, a question mark posed to the emptiness. When they finally emerged back onto the road far past it, Chris glanced back. The figure was gone. Or perhaps it had never been there at all. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light, a gathering of shadows that the shifting proportions of the land had conjured from nothing. That night, they did not make a fire. The cold bit deep. They huddled together in the sleeping bag, back to back, sharing the animal warmth of their bodies. The sky was a vast, black emptiness, devoid of stars. The darkness felt thick, substantial, a pressure on the eyes. "Do you think Mom made it to the green?" Gregory whispered into the blackness. Chris stiffened. They had an agreement. They did not speak about her. The memory of her was a country they could no longer afford to visit. It was a landscape more desolate than the one they walked through now. "I don't know, Greg," he said, his voice tight. "Go to sleep." The house felt small. The boy continued, as if he hadn't heard. The last morning, the ceilings were so low, like they were pushing down on us. Chris remembered. He remembered the feeling of the walls closing in, the hallway stretching as he ran to her room, his own footsteps echoing as if in a cavern. He had thought it was panic, grief. Now he was not so sure. Had the world begun its subtle warping even then? Was it them, or was it everything? He didn't answer. He listened to his son S breathing even out, listened to the wind that was not quite wind, a sound like a distant, mournful chorus. He felt the vast, empty space around them, a space that was no longer reliable, that could contract or expand on a whim. He felt like a specimen trapped in a glass box that some unseen hand was constantly resizing. The days bled into one another, a monotony of gray light and aching feet. The distortions became more pronounced. One morning, Gregory S. Canteen, which had always fit neatly in the side pocket of his pack, was suddenly too large to squeeze in. Chris spent 10 minutes trying to force it, his hands shaking with a quiet rage, before he realized the absurdity of it, and tied it to the outside with a piece of cord. Another time, a mile they walked felt like 10, the landscape refusing to slide past. And then the next mile was over in what felt like a handful of steps. They grew thinner, their cheeks hollowed, their eyes sinking deeper into their skulls. Chris watched Gregory and saw the boy S body changing, not just from hunger, but from the same spatial sickness that afflicted the world. His limbs seemed out of proportion, too long for his torso. His shadow, when it appeared, was a grotesque, elongated parody of a child. They found a town, or what was left of one. The sign was so rusted the name was unreadable. The buildings were husks, their roofs caved in, their windows staring like dead eyes. The main street, however, was perfectly, normally proportioned. It felt like a sanctuary. The buildings were a comfortable distance apart. The sky was a straight, narrow ribbon above them. For a few hours, the terrible, stretching anxiety left Chris. He felt almost human. They scavenged in the silent structures. In what had been a grocery store, they found nothing but dust and the ghost of old smells. In a small house at the end of a street, its white picket fence now a row of rotten teeth, they struck a small treasure. A jar of pickles, forgotten at the back of a basement shelf. The glass was cloudy, the pickles inside a pale, ghostly green. It was the most beautiful thing Chris had seen in years. Back on the street, sitting on the curb, they used the knife to pry open the rusted lid. The smell was sharp, acidic, a shocking assault on senses dulled by ash and decay. Chris handed the first pickle to Gregory. The boy took it with reverence and bit into it with a crisp, loud crunch that echoed unnaturally in the silence. A smile, a real, genuine smile, broke out on his face. It was a light in the gloom, a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. It was then that the man emerged from a doorway across the street. He was tall and skeletally thin, dressed in rags that flapped around him like dead skin. His face was a skull with paper stretched over it. In his hands, he held a length of pipe. "Share," the man croaked. His voice was the sound of stones grinding together. Chris was on his feet in an instant, pushing Gregory behind him. He held the jar tight. It was not just food. It was the smile on his son's face. It was a memory of a world where things could be crisp and bright and good. "We have nothing to share," Chris said, his voice low and steady. He let his hand drift toward the pistol tucked into his belt. The man's eyes, deep sunk and fever bright, fixed on the jar. "The green," he whispered. "You have the green." He took a step forward. His movements were jerky, unnatural. "The world is hungry. It needs to be fed. It stretches because it's hungry." The words hit Chris like a physical blow. This stranger had given voice to the unspoken terror. The man took another step. The street, which had felt so comfortingly narrow moments before, now felt like a canyon. The man, a distant threat that was suddenly, impossibly, right in front of them. The proportions shifted again, the space between them collapsing in a dizzying lurch. Chris drew the pistol. The click of the hammer cocking was the loudest sound in the universe. The man stopped. He looked from the gun to Chris's face, and then to Gregory, who was peeking out from behind his father's legs. A strange understanding seemed to dawn in his desperate eyes. He nodded slowly, a sad, final gesture. "It will take what it needs," the man said. Then he turned and shuffled away, his form seeming to shrink and recede down the street with unnatural speed, swallowed by the gray until he was gone. Chris stood trembling, the gun heavy in his hand. He uncocked it and put it away. The smell of the pickles was now cloying, sickly sweet. The moment of joy was shattered. They left the town and its brief, illusory safety. The land outside was worse than before. The hills were now great, rolling swells, like a petrified ocean. The sky was a crushing weight, so low Chris felt he could reach up and touch its cold, leathery hide. Gregory's breathing was ragged. He stumbled often, his body no longer obeying the commands of a brain that could not trust the ground beneath its feet. Chris carried him. The boy was light, a bundle of sticks and feverish heat. He mumbled in his half-sleep, words about shrinking rooms and growing doors. Chris walked. He walked until his legs were numb, until the world was a smear of gray and pain. road was gone now, swallowed by the featureless landscape. He was navigating by instinct, by the faint, desperate pull of the fairy tale called the green. He crested a rise and stopped. Below him was a valley, and in the center of the valley there was a spot of color. It was green, not the ghostly green of the pickles, but a deep, vibrant, impossible green. A small, perfect circle of grass, and in its center, a single gnarled apple tree, heavy with fruit that glowed like red lanterns in the gloom. Chris's knees buckled. He sank to the ground, Gregory a dead weight in his arms. He wept, great, heaving sobs that tore at his throat. They had made it. The green was real. But as he looked, the joy curdled into a new kind of dread. The valley was too perfect. The circle of grass was too round, like a hole punched through the gray world into another. The tree stood in absolute symmetry, its branches a mirror image on either side. It did not look real. It looked like a painting, or a memory so intensely recalled that it had manifested in 3 dimensions. He carried Gregory down the slope. The descent took forever. The green circle did not get closer in a linear way. It pulsed, sometimes seeming just a few feet away, sometimes receding to a tiny dot. The air grew warmer, and for the first time in years, he smelled the rich, loamy scent of healthy earth. It was the smell of life, and it was terrifying. Finally, he stood at the edge of the green. The transition was abrupt. One foot was on cracked, gray dirt, the other was on lush, soft grass. He stepped fully into the circle. The silence here was different. It was not the dead silence of the outside world, but a deep, humming quiet, full of latent energy. He laid Gregory down at the base of the apple tree. The boy's eyes fluttered open. "Dad," he murmured, "it's warm." "We ray safe," Chris said, though he knew, with a certainty that chilled his soul, that they were not. "We found it." He reached up and picked an apple. It was firm and warm from the sun that was not there. He polished it on his shirt and handed it to his son. Gregory took it and bit into it. The sound was obscenely loud, a crack of life in the stillness. Juice, clear and sweet, ran down his chin. Chris watched him eat, and as he watched, he saw the change begin. The hollows in Gregory's cheeks seemed to fill, not with health, but with a smooth, unlined perfection. The dirt on his face faded away. His eyes, once so old and knowing, grew bright and blank, like the glass eyes of a doll. He was becoming more real, more perfect, and in doing so, he was ceasing to be Gregory. Chris looked down at his own hands. The scars and calluses were smoothing out. The ingrained dirt was disappearing from his skin. The deep, grinding hunger in his stomach was gone, replaced by a placid, unsettling fullness. He felt the memories of the long road, of his wife, of the man with the pipe, beginning to soften at the edges, their emotional weight dissolving like sugar in water. This was not salvation. This was consumption. The world was hungry, the man had said. It stretches because it is hungry. This green place was not an escape from the unraveling world, it was its stomach. A place where things were digested, their rough edges smoothed away, their painful histories erased, and absorbed into a bland, perfect stillness. He looked at his son, who was smiling a serene, empty smile. He was no longer carrying the burden of survival. He was becoming part of the scenery, a beautiful, permanent fixture in this beautiful, permanent trap. Chris stumbled back, away from the tree, away from his son. He crossed the sharp boundary back into the gray. The cold and the hunger rushed back into him like a shock. It was agony, but it was his agony. It was real. From the gray waste, he looked back at the green circle. Gregory was standing now under the tree, looking at him. There was no recognition in his eyes, no plea, no fear. He was just a boy in a garden. He held out another perfect apple, an offering. Chris turned away. He began to walk back into the vast, distorted, and hungry land. The proportions of the world shifted around him, the hills rising like waves, the sky pressing down. He was alone now, carrying a different weight. He walked, not toward anything, not away from anything, but simply because it was the last, true thing he knew how to do. And behind him, the perfect green circle, containing the boy who was once his son, began to slowly, inexorably, shrink out of existence. The silence that settled after the green vanished was the deepest yet. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence of nothingness, a void that pressed against his eardrums. He walked. The ground seemed to give slightly under his boots, a spongy resistance that was new. The gray light had taken on a different quality, a dull sheen like wet slate. He found he could not think of Gregory. The moment he tried to form his son's face in his mind, the image would warp and slide away, replaced by the serene, empty smile under the apple tree. It was as if the green place had not just consumed his son, but was actively eating the memory of him, digesting the past. Chris clung to the pain instead. The ache in his legs, the gnawing in his stomach, the raw chill on his skin. These sensations were a fence against the forgetting. Hours or days later, he came to a river. It was not a stream of brown water, but a wide, black expanse, flowing without a sound. Its surface was perfectly smooth, a sheet of dark glass reflecting the featureless sky. There was no current he could see, yet the opposite shore was impossibly far, a thin, dark line on the horizon. A single, flat-bottomed boat was tied to a splintered post on the bank. It was old, the wood bleached and cracked, but it looked sound. He knew he had to cross. There was no reason. Reason had died with Gregory's smile. It was simply the next thing to do. He untied the rough rope and pushed the boat out onto the black water. It slid forward without a ripple. He took up the single oar and dipped it into the river. The water was thick, like oil, and offered no resistance. When he pulled, the boat glided forward silently, but the shore behind him did not recede. The far shore did not approach. He was paddling in place, trapped on a stationary expanse of black glass. He stopped, letting the oar rest across his knees. He looked down into the water. At first, he saw only the reflection of the haze. Then, deep below the surface, a light flickered. It was a faint, golden glow, like a distant window in a dark house. As he stared, the light grew, resolving into a scene. He saw a kitchen, yellow walls. A woman was standing at a stove, her back to him. She hummed a tune he almost recognized. It was his wife, not as she was at the end, but from years before, on a simple morning in a world that was whole. The image was so vivid, so achingly real, that he leaned over the side, his hand outstretched. His fingers broke the surface. The water was not cold, but warm like skin. The moment he touched it, the scene below shifted. The kitchen dissolved into a hospital room, stark and white. She was lying in a bed, her face pale, her eyes closed. The memory, sharp as a shard of glass, pierced him. This was the last time. The room had felt so small, the air so thick. A voice, not from the water, but from all around him, whispered, "It's easier to let go. The current will take you to her." The voice was gentle, persuasive. It promised an end to the walking, an end to the hunger. It promised a reunion in the quiet depths. He felt a tremendous pull, a desire to simply roll over the side and sink into the warm, welcoming memory. But he remembered the man in the town. It will take what it needs. This river was another kind of stomach. It wasn't offering peace. It was offering to drown him in a past it would then consume. He snatched his hand back. The water felt sticky now, clinging to his skin like syrup. He grabbed the oar again, not to paddle, but to push against the nothingness. He focused not on the distant shore, but on the act itself. The strain in his shoulders, the grip of his hands on the rough wood. He pushed and pulled, a meaningless effort in a meaningless place. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the boat began to move. The far shore crept closer. It was not a victory. It was simply a change. When the bow finally scraped against the opposite bank, the sound was shockingly loud. He stepped out, his legs trembling. He turned to look back at the river. It was gone. In its place was a flat, gray plain, identical to the one he stood on. There was no boat. There was no water. There was only the endless, hungry land. He walked on. His shadow, when it appeared, was no longer a stretched giant. It was small and hunched, clinging to his heels as if afraid of the open ground. He was no longer an ant on a plate. He was a speck of dust in a vast, dark room, and the room was still growing. The horizon was no longer a line, but a suggestion, a smudge of slightly darker gray against the universal light. Chris walked toward it because there was no other direction. The ground had lost its texture, becoming a seamless, firm surface that gave off a low, constant hum he felt in his teeth. He was a needle drawn toward a weak magnet, his progress measured only by the gradual, imperceptible thickening of the gloom ahead. He found the forest. It was not made of trees, but of pillars. They were smooth and gray, rising from the floor to vanish into the haze above. They were arranged in no pattern he could discern, some so close together he had to turn sideways to slip through. Others spaced so far apart they were solitary monoliths in the emptiness. The air within the forest was still and cold, hum of the ground was muted here, replaced by a faint, high-pitched ringing. He moved deeper, his hand occasionally brushing against a pillar. The surface was not stone. It was warm and slightly yielding, like skin stretched over bone. He pulled his hand away, wiping it on his ragged pants. He had long since stopped feeling hunger or thirst. His body was a machine that walked, powered by a fading spark of defiance. The memory of Gregory was a locked box in his mind. He dared not open it for fear of what he would find, or not find, inside. A shape emerged from behind a pillar. It was human, or had been. Its form was blurred, as if seen through a dirty lens. It moved without walking, gliding a few inches above the floor. It had no face, only a smooth, pale oval where features should have been. It did not approach him, but simply observed, turning its headless head as he passed. Soon, there were others. They drifted between the pillars, silent sentinels in the silent wood. They were the digested, he realized. The ones who had given in to the river, or the green, or some other temptation. Their edges had been smoothed away until only this vague impression remained. He walked for what felt like years within the forest of pillars. His own edges began to feel less distinct. Sometimes he would look at his hands and see the gray light passing through them. The high-pitched ringing was inside his head now, a constant companion. He forgot the feel of grass. He forgot the taste of an apple. He forgot the sound of his own name. One of the blurred figures glided directly into his path. It stopped, its form shimmering. A whisper, not a sound, but a vibration in the air, reached him. Rest. Chris tried to speak, but his throat was dust. He shook his head, a slow, heavy motion. The figure extended a limb that was not quite an arm. A wave of profound weariness washed over Chris. It would be so easy to stop, to let his form soften and blur, to join the silent drift between the pillars. There would be no more pain, no more walking. The thought was a seductive poison. He focused on the pain. He clawed for it, digging through the numbness. He found a sharp memory, not of Gregory, but of the man with the pipe. The desperation in his eyes, the truth in his croaked words. The world is hungry. Chris held onto that desperation. It was ugly and raw, but it was his. He pushed forward, walking straight through the shimmering figure. It dissolved into a cloud of mist, and then reformed behind him. He did not look back. The pillars began to thin. The gloom ahead deepened from gray to black. The floor sloped gently downward. The humming in the ground grew stronger, a deep bass note that vibrated in his chest. The ringing in his head faded away, replaced by this new physical sensation. The air grew warmer, carrying a smell he had not encountered in an eternity. It was the smell of ozone, of a lightning strike. He emerged from the forest of pillars onto the shore of a sea. There was no water. The sea was a flat, black expanse that reflected nothing. Above it, the haze had coalesced into a swirling, leaden cloud cover. But far out on the black plain, something was happening. The fabric of the world was twisting, warping in on itself. Space itself was convulsing, creating vast, silent whirlpools of non-light. He could see the pillars of the forest being drawn toward it, stretching into long, thin lines before snapping and vanishing into the vortex. This was not a stomach. This was a heart, a diseased, spasming heart at the center of the hungry world, and he knew with a certainty that was his last coherent thought, that he was to be its next beat. He took a step onto the black surface. It held his weight. He took another. He did not walk toward the vortex. He simply walked, a final, pointless act of movement. The humming was all there was. The vortex grew, not because he approached it, but because it was expanding to meet him. The wind began to pull at him, a silent, terrible force that promised an end to walking. He closed his eyes. He did not think of his son. He did not think of his wife. He thought of the weight of the pistol in his hand, the crunch of a pickle, the sound of a breath evening out into sleep. Small, hard things, real things. Then the wind took him, and the humming stopped. The sensation was not of being torn apart, but of being unfolded. Every memory, every sensation, every moment of pain and joy was smoothed out like a map on a table. He saw the entire ragged tapestry of his life laid bare, and then he felt a presence examining it. It was not a malevolent presence, nor a benevolent one. It was simply hungry. It was the world, and it was tasting him. It found the memory of the green place and hesitated. There was a flavor there it did not recognize, a residue it could not process. It was the residue of his choice, the choice to turn away from false peace, to embrace the agony of being real. The hunger recoiled from it, confused. This was not nourishment. This was a splinter, a piece of grit that could not be digested. The unfolding stopped. The map of his life was crumpled back into a shape, but a different shape. He was not cast out. He was spat back. He opened his eyes. He was on his knees on the hard, gray ground. The vortex was gone. The sea of blackness was gone. He was at the edge of the forest of pillars, but the pillars were receding, fading into the haze like ghosts. The world was still, but the oppressive weight was less. The gray light was softer. He looked at his hands. They were solid. The scars were back. The dirt was back. The hunger in his stomach was a sharp, welcome pain. He was Chris. He was himself. He stood up, his body aching with a familiar, honest weariness. He began to walk again, not as a speck of dust, but as a man. The landscape began to resolve into features he understood. A low hill, a dry creek bed, the skeleton of a tree. In the distance, he saw a flicker of movement that was not a blurred figure. It was a person stumbling as he had stumbled, a survivor. The world was still hungry, but he was no longer just food. He was a splinter in its gut. He was a truth it could not digest. He changed his course, walking not away from anything, but toward the other figure. His feet on the hard ground made a sound. It was the sound of a man walking. It was a small sound, but in the vast silence, it was enough. He moved toward the figure with a caution born of 1,000 betrayals. As he drew closer, he saw it was a woman. Her clothes were rags, her hair a matted tangle. She was on her hands and knees, scraping at the hard ground with a piece of rock, as if searching for something that was not there. She had not seen him. He stopped a dozen paces away. "Hello," he said. His voice was a rusty croak, unfamiliar to his own ears. The woman flinched violently, scrambling backward. She held up the rock like a weapon. Her eyes were wide with a feral terror, but they were sharp. They saw him. They recognized him as a thing separate from the gray waste. "I'm not going to hurt you," Chris said, keeping his hands visible and empty. She stared at him, her chest heaving. The fear in her eyes slowly gave way to a profound, weary confusion. She lowered the rock. "You're here," she whispered. It was not a question, but a statement of impossible fact. "I'm here," he confirmed. She looked past him, toward the horizon where the vortex had been. "I saw it, the pulling. I thought it was the end." Her gaze returned to him, searching. "You were there, weren't you?" "At the center." Chris nodded. He saw no point in lying. "I was." "What did it do to you?" Her voice was barely audible. "It tried to eat me," he said simply. "It couldn't." The woman stared at him for a long time. The silence stretched, but it was a different silence now. It was a silence shared by two people. She dropped the rock. It clattered on the hard ground, a sharp, real sound. "My name is Alara," she said. "Chris." She gestured weakly at the ground where she had been digging. "I thought there might be water. I thought I remembered water." She gave a short, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "I don't remember much anymore." Chris took a step closer. He saw the hollows in her cheeks, the tremor in her hands. She was where he had been before the green place, on the edge of being consumed by the land's emptiness. "There's no water here," he said, "but there's a way to keep walking." How? The word was a plea. He didn't have an answer, not a real one. He looked at his own scarred hands, then back at her. "You hold on to what hurts. You remember the things it wants you to forget." Alara looked skeptical, exhausted. "Remember what?" "There's nothing left to remember." "Then start with this," Chris said. "Remember my name, Chris, and I will remember yours, Alara." It was a small thing, a seemingly meaningless thing. But he saw a flicker in her eyes, a tiny spark of focus. Remembering another person was an act of defiance. It was a way of building a world, however small, inside the hungry one. He offered her his hand. She looked at it for a long moment, then reached out and took it. Her grip was surprisingly strong. He helped her to her feet. She swayed, unsteady, but she stood. "Which way?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Chris looked around. The landscape was still gray and barren, but the oppressive distortion was gone. The hills were just hills. The sky was just a sky. He pointed in the direction he had been walking before he saw her. There was no reason to choose it over any other. It was simply a direction. "That way," he said. Together, they began to walk. Their footsteps made a soft, syncopated rhythm on the hard earth. It was not the sound of salvation. It was the sound of two splinters moving through the gut of a hungry world. And for the first time since he had left the green circle, Chris felt not the chill of loneliness, but the faint, fragile warmth of a shared purpose. They were not going to find an escape. They were going to be a reminder, a truth that would not be digested. They walked until the gray light began to deepen into a twilight that felt earned. The land started to change. The seamless ground gave way to patches of coarse, gray grass that crunched under their feet. The air lost its sterile hum and carried the faint, damp smell of soil. It was not a welcoming change, but it was a change. It was real. Alara stumbled often, her strength fading. Chris stayed beside her, his arm a steadying presence when she needed it. She did not speak, and he did not press her. The silence between them was a pact. They were saving their strength for the walking. As the darkness gathered, they found a shallow depression in the lee of a low, rocky ridge. It offered no shelter, but it was a place to stop. They sank to the ground, their backs against the cold stone. Alara curled into a ball, shivering. Chris sat watching the plain, his ears straining for any sound that was not their own breathing. "Tell me something," Alara's voice was a thin thread in the dark. Something real from before. Chris was silent for a long time, sifting through the locked box of his memories. He chose one not for its joy, but for its mundane solidity. "I had a truck," he began, his voice low. "An old Ford. The heater only worked on the highest setting, and it smelled like burnt dust. But on a cold morning, when you first turned the key, the engine would turn over with a sound like it was clearing its throat. It was a grumpy old thing, but it was reliable." He could feel Alara listening in the darkness. He could almost see the memory taking shape in her mind. "I had a bicycle," she said after a pause. "It was blue. The chain would come off if you pedaled too hard uphill." She let out a soft, shaky breath. "I hated that bicycle." A corner of Chris's mouth twitched. It was almost a smile. But it was real. "It was real," she whispered. They lapsed back into silence, but the darkness felt less absolute. They had populated it with a grumpy truck and a faulty bicycle. They were tiny anchors in the vastness. Chris must have dozed, because he was jolted awake by a sound. It was a soft, scraping sound, like stone on stone. He sat up, every sense alert. Alara was awake too, her body rigid beside him. The sound came again, from the top of the ridge. Against the slightly lighter sky, he saw a silhouette. It was a man, but his outline was wrong. He was misshapen, hunched, and bulky. He was dragging something heavy behind him. The figure stopped at the crest of the ridge and looked down at them. Chris could feel the weight of its gaze. It did not have the blurred emptiness of the figures in the pillar forest. This thing was solid, and its hunger was a physical force. The man took a step down the slope, then another. The scraping sound was the thing he was dragging, a large, woven sack, lumpy and full. As he came closer, Chris saw that the bulking shape on the man's back was not a hump, but a second, smaller sack, strapped tightly to his shoulders. His face was hidden in shadow. Alara made a small, terrified sound and pressed closer to the rock. The man stopped a few yards away. He dropped the heavy sack. It landed with a dull, wet thud. He stood there, breathing heavily, smelling of dust and something metallic. "Travelers," the man said. His voice was gravel, grinding deep in his chest. "You are far from the trails." "We're just passing through," Chris said, standing up slowly. He positioned himself between the man and Alara. The man laughed, a short, harsh bark. "There is no just passing through. You are either lost or you are looking. Which is it?" "We're walking," Chris said. The man took another step forward. The dim light finally reached his face. It was gaunt, with skin like leather stretched over bone. His eyes were small, dark pits, but it was his mouth that held Chris's attention. The man's lips were sewn shut with thick, black thread. The stitches were crude and old, the flesh around them swollen and discolored. "The walking is the easy part," the man said, the words muffled and strained by the closed mouth. He gestured to the sack at his feet with a heavily scarred hand. "The carrying is the burden, but a necessary one. The world must be fed." He nudged the sack with his foot. A corner of the rough fabric fell open. Inside, Chris saw a jumble of objects: a tarnished silver locket, a child's wooden toy cracked in half, a single mud-caked shoe. They were not just things. They were memories, solidified, the residue of digested lives. The man's dark eyes fixed on Chris, then shifted to Alara. "You have something. I can smell it on you. You have been to the heart and you have been rejected." He said the word with a mixture of disgust and awe. "You are spoiled meat. But her," he pointed a finger at Alara. "She is still fresh, still full of sweet, untapped pain." Chris felt a cold fury rise in him. It was clean and sharp. "You can't have her." The stitch-mouthed man smiled, or tried to, the black threads pulled taut against his flesh. "I am not the hunger. I am the feeder. I gather what is left behind. I prepare the feast." He bent down and picked up his sack. "But you are a new thing, a thorn. The hunger will not like thorns." He hefted the sack onto his shoulder, the weight of it making him stagger. He gave them one last, long look, his eyes lingering on Chris with a strange, calculating curiosity. Then he turned and continued his journey along the ridge, the sack scraping against the stone, the sound slowly fading into the night. Chris stood watching until the man was gone. The encounter had not been a battle, but a warning. The world had many ways to feed, and now it knew they were here. Alara was trembling uncontrollably. "What was that?" she choked out. "What did he want?" "He's a scavenger," Chris said, his voice low and steady. He kept his eyes on the empty ridge. "He collects what the world leaves behind, the pieces of people." He looked down at his own hands, remembering the feeling of being unfolded. He wondered what small, hard thing of his would have ended up in that sack if he had given in. He said I was fresh, Alara whispered, horror-struck. You are, I was. Everyone is, until they're not. He finally turned to her. The fear in her eyes was a live thing. But he's afraid of me. He called me a thorn. That's our advantage. Advantage for what? To keep walking until another one of those things finds us. She hugged her knees to her chest, her voice rising toward hysteria. He said the world won't like thorns. What does that mean? It means we're a problem it hasn't figured out how to solve yet. Chris knelt in front of her. The memory of the grumpy truck was gone, replaced by the immediate, metallic smell of the stitch-mouthed man. Listen to me, Alara. Before I found you, I was alone. I was ready to be digested, but I made a choice. That choice is what saved me. It's what made me indigestible. You have to make that choice now. What choice? She cried. I don't understand any of this. The choice to feel everything. The fear, the pain, the hunger. The choice to remember the blue bicycle you hated. The choice to want to live, even if living is just walking through this hell. Don't let the numbness take you. That's what it wants. He saw the struggle in her face, the temptation to shut down, to let the gray waste seep into her soul and smooth her away. It was the easier path. Then her eyes focused on his. She was looking at the scars on his face, the grim set of his jaw. She saw a man who had walked into the heart of nothing and walked back out. Okay, she breathed, the word a shuddering concession. Okay. They did not sleep again. They sat shoulder to shoulder against the rock, watching the darkness slowly dilute into the familiar, grim gray. When the light was strong enough to see by, they stood. Chris's body protested, every muscle stiff and sore. Alara looked frail, but her eyes held a new resolve. They climbed the ridge where the feeder had stood. From the top, the view was the same yet different. The barren plains stretched ahead, but now Chris could see faint, winding paths etched into the hard ground. They were not roads made by people. They were trails worn by things like the stitch-mouthed man, routes for the feeders who served the hunger. We can't follow those, Alara said, understanding immediately. No, Chris agreed. He pointed away from the trails, toward a region where the land broke into a series of jagged, rocky gullies. It looked harder, more treacherous. We go there. The hard way, she said, not as a question. It's the only way that's ours. They descended the far side of the ridge and set off across the broken land. The going was slow. The rocks were sharp, and the gullies were deep shadows where anything could be hiding. The gray sky offered no comfort, but with every difficult step, Chris felt a little stronger. He was not drifting. He was navigating. Around midday, they found the first sign that they were not the only thorns. It was a mark scratched into a flat, dark stone at the entrance to a narrow canyon. It wasn't a word or a picture. It was a simple, sharp line crossed by two smaller lines, like a crude bone. It felt intentional, Alara traced the mark with her finger. "What is it?" "I don't know," Chris said, "but it's not a feeder's mark. It's too clean." He looked down the dark mouth of the canyon. The silence here was different. It was a waiting silence. He made a decision. "We follow this." Alara nodded, her trust in him a fragile but growing thing. They entered the canyon, the high walls closing in around them, casting them into a deep twilight. The only sound was the scuff of their feet on the stone. After 100 yards, the canyon opened into a small, circular basin. And there, huddled in a shallow cave at the base of the far wall, were 3 figures. They were thin and ragged, but their eyes were sharp. They were not blurred. They were real. One of them, a man with a wild beard and eyes that held a fierce, unbroken light, stood up. He held a sharpened piece of rock like a knife. He looked from Chris to Alara, his gaze lingering on Chris, assessing him. Then his eyes dropped to the ground near Chris's feet, to a patch of dirt where Chris had unconsciously scuffed a mark with his heel. It was the same mark as on the stone outside. A line crossed. The man with the rock knife lowered his weapon. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing softly in the stone basin. "Welcome to the resistance." The word hung in the air between them, solid and impossible. Resistance. It implied an enemy. It implied a fight. Chris had thought his only purpose was to be a splinter, a persistent irritation. But this man was talking about an organized wound. The bearded man gestured for them to come closer. The other 2 in the cave, a woman with a shaved head and a younger man missing an eye, watched with a guarded but curious intensity. They were living skeletons, but their spines were straight. "I am Kale," the bearded man said. He pointed to the mark on the ground. "You bear the sigil. Unconsciously, perhaps, but you bear it. It means you have faced the hunger and kept your name. My name is Chris. This is Alara." He felt Alara tense beside him, but she held her ground. Kale nodded, his eyes softening slightly as he looked at Alara. "It is a hard thing to be found before you are lost. You are lucky." He turned and led them into the shallow cave. It was not a home. It was a hiding place. A few dried roots lay in a corner, and a cracked gourd held a tiny amount of murky water. "We saw a man," Chris said, the image of the stitched mouth vivid in his mind. "On the ridge last night. He carried sacks." Kale's face darkened. "A feeder. They are the hands of the hunger. They glean the fields after the harvest, picking up the scraps of souls that are not fully consumed." He spat on the cave floor. "They are cowards. They serve to save their own skins, thinking they will be spared. But in the end, the hunger always turns on its servants." "He was afraid of Chris," Alara said, her voice small but clear. Kale looked back at Chris, a new respect in his gaze. As he should be. The feeders sense a disruption, a flaw in the system. You are that flaw. He picked up a small, smooth stone from the ground and began turning it over in his hand. The hunger is not a mind, not as we understand it. It is a force, a vast, empty need. It consumes worlds not out of malice, but out of a void that can never be filled. It takes everything matter, memory, time, and grinds it down into nothing. The woman with the shaved head spoke for the first time, her voice a low rasp. But nothing is ever truly gone. It leaves a residue, a silence where a sound used to be, a cold spot where there was once warmth. Cale held up the smooth stone. This was a mountain once. The feeling of that mountain is gone, digested, but the fact of it remains. We are like that. We are the facts that the hunger cannot erase. Our memories, our pain, our love. These are the indigestible things, the thorns. So the resistance. What do you do? Chris asked. We remember, Cale said simply. We find others who remember. We share our stories. We carve our names on the stones that are left. Every memory shared is a fortress built. Every name spoken is a weapon forged. We are making a world inside the belly of the beast, a world made of truths it cannot digest. He reached into a crevice in the cave wall and pulled out a larger, flat stone. It was covered in scratches, not words, but marks. A crooked line for a stubborn man, a circle for a woman who remembered the sun. The bone sigil, repeated again and again. This is our map, Cale said. Not of places, but of people, of thorns. Chris looked at the stone, then at the determined, hungry faces around him. He thought of the green circle, a perfect, isolated memory. It was a sanctuary, but it was a prison. This was different. This was a network, a web of defiance. Alara knelt and touched the stone map. My name is Alara, she said, as if testing the weight of it. I had a blue bicycle. I hated it. Cale smiled, a genuine, warm expression that transformed his gaunt face. He picked up a sharp flint and handed it to her. Then carve it, make it part of the world. As Alara began to scratch her truth into the stone, Chris looked out of the cave mouth toward the gray gully they had descended. The hunger was still out there, vast and patient. But for the first time, it did not feel invincible. It felt like a system, and systems could be broken. They were not just walking anymore. They were building.